Introduction to Commentaries on the Gallic War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James Christopher. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar. Translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Introduction. The first chapter of Caesar's conquest of Gaul contains a general sketch of Gallic history anterior to the conquest. While in ancient Britain and the invasions of Julius Caesar an attempt is made to tell the story of a man's life in our island from the earliest times in detail. The following introduction is a bare outline, intended to help readers who desire only to understand the translation. The Gauls whom Caesar encountered, and also the Britons, were a medley of diverse races. For both Britain and Gaul had been inhabited from the Paleolithic age, and had since been invaded by successive hordes belonging to various stocks. The latest, who began to arrive probably about the 8th century before our era, were the Celts or Gauls, properly so called, whose great stature and fair hair were so often noticed by ancient writers, who imposed the Celtic language upon the existing inhabitants, and of whom the Belgae were the rearguard. Many of them crossed the Channel and spread into Scotland and even into Ireland. The questions, originally raised by Caesar's opening words, relating to the Godels and Brythons, the two main branches of the Celtic stock, are fully discussed in the books to which I have referred. The Gauls, who became known to the Romans about the beginning of the 4th century before Christ, were an offshoot of this people, and entered Lombardy through the northern passes of the Alps. They had already been settled there for a considerable time when, in 388 B.C., a detachment marched southward, defeated the Romans in the Battle of Allia, and sacked Rome. Renewed incursions made from time to time during the next century were repelled. In 282 B.C., the Republic was finally released from the fear of Gallic invasion by a victory near the lake of Vidimo, and before the Second Punic War, the Romans, assuming the offensive, had fought their way to the Po. In the decade which followed the overthrow of Hannibal, their dominion in the plain was consolidated, and Italian settlers mingled with the surviving Gauls. About the middle of the 2nd century before Christ, the Greek colony in Massala, Marseille, asked the Romans to help them against the Ligurian tribes between the Maritime Alps and the Rhone, and the Republic seized the opportunity of gaining a footing in Transalpine Gaul, and thus securing communication by land with Spain. 30 years later the Aedui, who inhabited the Nivernais in western Burgundy, made a treaty with Rome, whose support they desired against their rivals. And soon afterwards, a crisis in Gallic politics gave the Romans an opening for attacking the Arverni, who possessed what is now Auvergne, and the Allobroges, whose territory was between the Lake of Geneva, the Rhone, and the Isère. A victory at the confluence of these streams assured thenceforward the Roman command of the lower Rhone, and the province which was now formed was gradually extended along the Cevennes and the Tarn, till its northern frontier reached the center of the Pyrenees. Italian brokers and moneylenders settled into provincial towns, and even in independent Gaul. And by the time when Caesar became governor, Roman civilization had taken root in the province, and was already influencing the Aedui and other tribes. Caesar's memoirs, the evidence of which is confirmed and supplemented by archaeology, show that the Gauls, even in the remotest parts, had risen far above the conditions of barbarism, that they practiced agriculture, were enriched by trade, had constructed a system of roads, and, notwithstanding constant internecine war, had developed political, military, and fiscal institutions. They were exposed, however, to attacks from the east, which not only menaced their own independence, but were a source of danger to Rome. The devastating incursions of the Cimbri and Teutoni at the end of the 2nd century before Christ were followed, after an interval of 30 years, by the invasion of the German chieftain Ariovistus, and, a few years later, by the appearance of marauders from Switzerland on the right bank of the Rhone. Thus, when Caesar was appointed governor of Illyricum and Gaul, his tenure of office was likely to be eventful, especially as this commission apparently gave him the right to include the whole of independent Gaul north of the province within his sphere of action. His appointment carried with it the command of an army consisting of 4 legions, perhaps about 20,000 men. One of them was quartered in Transalpine Gaul. The other 3 were at Aquileia, near the site of the modern Trieste. He could also command the services of slingers from the Balearic Isles, of archers from Numidia and Crete, and of cavalry from Spain. Various military reforms had been introduced by Marius, and the legions of Caesar were in many respects different from those which had fought against Hannibal. They were no longer a militia, but an army of professional soldiers. Each legion consisted of 10 cohorts, and the cohort, formed of 3 maniples or 6 centuries, had replaced the maniple as the tactical unit of the legion. From the earliest times the legion had been commanded by an officer called a military tribune. 6 were assigned to each legion, and each one of the number held command in turn. But they now owed their appointments to interest rather than to merit, and apparently no tribune in Caesar's army was ever placed at the head of a legion. They still had administrative duties to perform, and exercised subordinate commands. But the principal officers were the legati, who might loosely be called generals of division. Their powers were not strictly defined, but varied according to circumstances and to the confidences which they deserved. A legatus might be entrusted with the command of a legion, or of an army corps. He might even, in the absence of his chief, be entrusted with the command of the entire army, but he was not yet, as such, the permanent commander of a legion. The officers upon whom the efficiency of the troops mainly depended were the centurions. They were chosen from the ranks, and their position has been roughly compared to that of our own non-commissioned officers. But their duties were, in some respects, at least as responsible as those of a captain. The centurions of the first cohort were regularly summoned to councils of war, and the chief centurion of a legion was actually in a position to offer respectful suggestions to the legate himself. Each legion included in its ranks a number of skilled artisans called fabri, who have been likened to the engineers in a modern army, but they were not permanently enrolled in a separate corps. They fought in the ranks like other soldiers, but when their special services were required, they were directed by staff officers called praefecti fabrum. It was their duty to execute repairs of every kind, to superintend the construction of permanent camps, and to plan fortifications and bridges. And it should seem that they also had charge of the artillery, the ballistae and catapults, which hurled heavy stones and shot arrows against a besieged town, or the assailants of a post. The legionary wore a sleeveless woolen shirt, a leathern tunic protected across breast and back by bands of metal, and in cold or wet weather, a kind of blanket or military cloak. His defensive armor consisted of helmet, shield, and greaves. His weapons were a short, 2-edged cut-and-thrust sword and a javelin, the blade of which, behind the hardened point, was made of soft iron, so that when it struck home it might bend and not be available for return. These, however, formed only a part of the load which he carried on the march. Over his left shoulder he bore a pole, to which were fastened in a bundle his ration of grain, his cooking vessel, saw, basket, hatchet, and spade. For it was necessary that he should be a woodman and navvy as well as a soldier. No Roman army ever halted for the night without instructing a camp fortified with trench, rampart, and palisade. The column was, of course, accompanied by a host of non-combatants. Each legion required at least 500 or 600 horses and mules to carry its baggage and the drivers. With the slaves who waited on the officers formed a numerous body. Among the camp followers were also dealers, who supplied the wants of the army, and were ready to buy booty of every kind. What policy Caesar intended to follow he has not told us. While he was going forth to govern a distant land, the government of his own was lapsing into anarchy. He must have seen that the Germans would soon overrun Gaul, unless the Romans prevented them, and that their presence would revive the peril from which Marius had delivered Rome. We may feel sure that he had determined to teach them, by a rough lesson if necessary, that they must advance no further into Gaul, nor venture to cross the boundaries of the province or of Italy. It can hardly be doubted that he dreamed of adding a new province to the empire, which should round off its frontier and to its wealth. But whether he had definitely resolved to attempt a conquest of such magnitude, or merely intended to follow, as they appeared, the indications of fortune, it would be idle to conjecture. Ambitious though he was, he only courted, he never tempted her. The greatest statesman is, in a sense, an opportunist. When Caesar should find himself in Gaul, he would know best how to shape his ends. End of Introduction. Recording by James Christopher, jxchristopher@yahoo.com.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Becky Cook. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar. Translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book 1, Chapters 1 to 9. Campaigns against the Helvetii and Ariovistus. Gaul, taken as a whole, is divided into three parts, one of which is inhabited by the Belgae, another by the Aquitani, and the third by a people who call themselves Celts, and whom we call Gauls. These people differ from one another in language, institutions, and laws. The Gauls are separated from the Aquitani by the river Garonne, from the Belgae by the Marne and the Seine. Of all these peoples, the bravest are the Belgae, for they are furthest removed from the civilization and refinement of the province. Traders very rarely visit them with the wares which tend to produce moral enervation, and they are nearest to the Germans, who dwell on the further side of the Rhine, and are constantly at war with them. For the same reason the Helvetii also are braver than the other Gauls. They are fighting almost daily with the Germans, either trying to keep them out of their own country or making raids into theirs. That part of the whole country which, as we have said, is occupied by the Gauls, begins at the river Rhone and is bounded by the Garonne, the ocean, and the country of the Belgae. It extends, moreover, into the region occupied by the Sequani and the Helvetii to the Rhine, and its trend is towards the north. The territory of the Belgae, commencing from the most distant frontier of Gaul, extends to the lower Rhine and has a northerly and easterly aspect. Aquitania extends from the Garonne to the Pyrenees and that part of the ocean which is off the coast of Spain, and its outlook is towards the northwest. Preeminent among the Helvetii in rank and wealth was Orgetorix. In the consulship of Marcus Messala and Marcus Piso, he organized a conspiracy among the nobles in the hope of making himself king, and he persuaded the community to undertake a national emigration, as, being the most warlike of all the Gallic peoples, they could easily achieve dominion over the whole of Gaul. He had no difficulty in convincing them, because their country is limited everywhere by natural features, on one side by the Rhine, a broad, deep river which separates the Helvetian territory from the Germans, on another by the lofty range of the Jura between the Helvetii and the Sequani, on a third by the Lake of Geneva and the Rhone which separates our province from the Helvetii. These limits restricted their movements and made it comparatively difficult for them to attack their neighbours, and, being a warlike people, they chafed under this restraint. Moreover, considering their numbers and their renown as valiant warriors, they felt that their territories, only 240 miles long by 180 broad, were too small. Impelled by these motives and swayed by the influence of Orgetorix, they determined to make the necessary preparations for emigration, buying up all the draught cattle and wagons that they could obtain, bringing all available lands under cultivation, with the object of securing an abundance of grain for the journey, and establishing relations of peace and amity with the neighbouring tribes. They believed that 2 years would be sufficient to complete these preparations, and passed an enactment fixing their departure for the 3rd year. Orgetorix was chosen as leader, and undertook a mission to several tribes. In the course of his tour he persuaded a Sequanian named Casticus, whose father, Catamantalodes, had for many years held sovereignty over the Sequani, and had been honoured by the Roman Senate with the title of friend, to seize the royal power, which his father had held before him over his own tribe. He also persuaded Dumnorix, an Aeduan, brother of Diviciacus, who at the time held the principal power in his own country and was very popular with the masses, to make a similar attempt, and gave him his daughter in marriage. He convinced them that it would be quite easy to achieve their purpose, as he was going to seize sovereignty over his own tribe. The Helvetii were undoubtedly the strongest people in the whole of Gaul, and he affirmed that by his wealth and his armed force he would secure them the possession of their thrones. Enthralled by his eloquence, they swore mutual fidelity, and they hoped that, once they had secured their thrones, they would be able, backed by 3 powerful and stable peoples, to make themselves masters of the whole of Gaul. The scheme was made known to the Helvetii by informers. In accordance with the national custom, they insisted that Orgetorix should plead his cause in chains. If he were condemned, his inevitable punishment would be death at the stake. On the day fixed for the pleading, he made all his slaves from all parts, numbering 10,000, come to the trial, and marched thither at the head of all his retainers and debtors, who were very numerous. With their protection he escaped trial. Exasperated at this defiance, the community endeavored to assert their rights by force, and the authorities summoned a posse from the districts, when Orgetorix died. And there is some reason to suspect, so the Helvetii believe, that he died by his own hand. After his death the Helvetii in no way relaxed their efforts to carry out their intended emigration. As soon as they believed themselves ready for the enterprise, they set fire to all their strongholds, of which there were 12, their villages, numbering 400, and the remaining buildings, which belonged to individuals, and burned the whole of their grain, except what they were going to take with them, that they might have no hope of returning home, and so be more ready to face every danger. Every man was directed to take a supply of flour from his house for 3 months of his own use. They induced their neighbours, the Rairaki, the Tulingi, and the Lodobrigi, to join their enterprise, burn their strongholds and villages, and emigrate along with them. At the same time they formed a close alliance with the Boii, who had formerly dwelt on the further bank of the Rhine and had migrated into Noricum and taken Noreia. There were only 2 routes by which it was possible for them to leave their country. One, leading through the country of the Sequani and passing between the Jura and the Rhone, was so narrow and difficult that carts could barely pass along it one at a time, while a lofty mountain overhung it, so that a handful of men could easily stop them. The other, leading through our province, is much easier and more convenient, for the Rhone, which flows between the country of the Helvetii and that of the Allobroges, who had recently been subdued, is at certain points fordable. Geneva, the most remote town belonging to the Allobroges, is connected by a bridge with the country of the Helvetii, to which it is quite close. The Helvetii believed that they could either induce the Allobroges to let them pass through their country, as they were not yet apparently well disposed towards the Romans, or could compel them to do so. When everything was ready for their departure, they fixed the 28th of March, in the consulship of Lucius Piso and Aulus Gabinius, for the general muster on the banks of the Rhone. As soon as Caesar was informed that they were attempting to march through the province, he promptly quitted the capital, pushed on as fast as he could possibly travel into further Gaul, and made his way to the neighbourhood of Geneva. As the entire force in further Gaul amounted only to 1 legion, he ordered as many troops as possible to be raised throughout the province, and directed that the bridge at Geneva should be broken down. The Helvetii, on being informed of his approach, sent an embassy to him, composed of their most illustrious citizens, headed by Nemeius and Verclusius, to say that they purposed, with his consent, to march through the province, as there was no other route open to them, but that they would do no harm. Caesar, remembering that Lucius Cassius, when consul, had been slain by the Helvetii, and his army, defeated and forced to pass under their yoke, was not disposed to grant the request, and he was of opinion that if men of hostile temper were allowed to march through the province, they were not likely to refrain from outrage and mischief. Still, in order to gain time for his levies to assemble, he told the envoys that he would take some days for consideration. If they had any favour to ask, they might return on the 13th of April. Meantime, employing the legion which he had with him, and the troops which had assembled from the province, he constructed a rampart 16 feet high, and a trench from the lake of Geneva, which overflows into the Rhone, to the Jura, which separates the territory of the Sequani from the Helvetii, a distance of 19 miles. When these works were finished, he constructed redoubts and posted piquets to enable him to repel the Helvetii in case they attempted to force a passage. When the appointed day came round, and the envoys returned, he told them that he could not, consistently with the established usage of the Roman people, allow any one of them to march through the province, and he warned them that, if they attempted to use force, he would stop them. The disappointed Helvetii lashed barges together and made a number of rafts, while others forded the Rhone at the shallowest parts, sometimes in the day, but oftener at night, and tried to break through. But, foiled by the entrenchments, the rapid concentration of the troops, and their volleys of missiles, they abandoned their attempt. There remained only the route through the country of the Sequani, and it was so narrow that they could not advance if the Sequani objected. Being unable to win their consent by their own efforts, they sent envoys to the Aeduan Dumnorix, hoping by his intercession to gain their object. Dumnorix had great influence with the Sequani from his personal popularity and lavish bribery, and was well disposed towards the Helvetii, having married a daughter of Orgetorix, who belonged to that tribe. Moreover, his desire of royal power made him eager for revolution, and he wished to lay as many tribes as possible under obligations to himself. Accordingly he undertook the mission. He induced the Sequani to allow the Helvetii to pass through their territory, and effected an exchange of hostages between the two peoples, the Sequani undertaking not to obstruct the march of the Helvetii to abstain from mischief and outrage. End of chapters 1 through 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Becky Cook. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar. Translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book 1, chapters 10 to 15. Caesar was informed that the Helvetii intended to march through the territories of the Sequani and the Aedui and make for the country of the Santones, which is not far from that of the Tolosates, a provincial tribe. He saw that, if this happened, it would be very dangerous to the province to have a warlike population, hostile to the Roman people, close to its rich and defenceless cornfields. For these reasons he placed Titus Labienus, one of his generals, in charge of the entrenchments which he had constructed, hastened to Italy by forced marches, raised 2 legions there, withdrew 3 from their winter quarters in the neighbourhood of Aquileia, and advanced rapidly with all 5 by the shortest road leading over the Alps into further Gaul. The Citrones, Griocelli, and Carterages seized the Alpine heights and tried to stop the advance of the army. Beating them off in several combats, he made his way in 7 days from Alculum, the extreme point of the Cisalpine province, into the territory of the Vocontii in the further province. Thence he led the army into the country of the Allobroges, and from their country into that of the Segusiavi, the first people outside the province beyond the Rhone. The Helvetii had by this time threaded the pass, crossed the country of the Sequani, and reached that of the Aedui, whose lands they were ravaging. The Aedui, unable to defend themselves or their property against their attacks, sent a deputation to Caesar to ask for help, pleading that they had at all times deserved well of the Roman people, and it was not right that their land should be ravaged, their children carried off into slavery, and their towns captured almost under the eyes of our army. At the same time, the Ambari, who were connected to the Aedui by friendship and blood, informed Caesar that their lands had been laid waste, and that it was more than they could do to repel the enemy's attacks upon their towns. The Allobroges also, who possessed villages and estates on the further side of the Rhone, fled to Caesar, alleging that they had nothing left except the bare soil. For these reasons, Caesar decided that it would be unwise to wait till his allies had lost all that they possessed, and the Helvetii reached the country of the Santoni. A river called the Saone flows through the territories of the Aedui and the Sequani, and discharges itself into the Rhone. Its current is so incredibly sluggish that it is impossible to tell, by merely looking, in which direction it is flowing. The Helvetii were crossing it in rafts and small boats lashed together. Learning from his patrols that about 1/4 were still on the near side of the river, while 3/4 had passed over, he started from his camp in the 3rd watch, with 3 legions, and came up with the division which had not yet crossed. Attacking them unexpectedly while their movements were impeded, he destroyed a great many. The rest took to flight and concealed themselves in the neighbouring woods. The clan in question was called the Tigurini, the entire Helvetian community being divided into 4 clans. This clan, acting independently, had emigrated within the memory of our fathers, and made the army of the consul Lucius Cassius, who was himself killed, pass under the yoke. Thus, either by accident or divine providence, that section of the Helvetian community which had brought a signal disaster upon the Roman people was the first to pay the penalty. In this action Caesar avenged a family wrong, as well as the wrongs of his country. For a general named Lucius Piso, the grandfather of his father-in-law Lucius Piso, had perished in the same battle as Cassius at the hands of the Tigurini. After fighting this action, Caesar bridged the Saone with the object of pursuing the rest of the Helvetian force, and thereby conveyed his army across. The Helvetii, seeing that he had effected in a single day the passage of the river, which they had accomplished with the greatest difficulty in 20 days, and alarmed by his unexpected advance, sent an embassy to meet him headed by Divico, who had commanded in the campaign against Cassius. He addressed Caesar in the following terms: if the Roman people would make peace with the Helvetii, they would go wherever Caesar fixed their abode, and would remain there. But if he persisted in his hostile attitude, he would do well to remember the disaster which had befallen the Roman people in the past and the ancient valour of the Helvetii. Granted that he had surprised one clan at a moment when their countrymen had crossed the river and could not help them, he need not therefore exaggerate his own prowess, or look down upon them. The lesson they had learned from their fathers and their forefathers was to fight like men, and not to rely upon trickery or ambuscade. Let him not, then, suffer the place where they stood to derive its name from a Roman reverse and from the annihilation of an army, or bequeath the remembrance thereof to posterity. Caesar replied that he had no reason to hesitate, because he well remembered the events which the Helvetian envoys had recounted, and he remembered them with indignation, for the Roman people had not deserved what had befallen them. If they had been conscious of wrongdoing, it would have been easy to take precautions, but they had been deceived because they were not conscious of having done anything to justify alarm, and saw no necessity for taking alarm without reason. Even if he were willing to forget an old affront, how could he banish the recollections of fresh outrages? Their attempt to force a passage through the province in despite of him, and their raids upon the Aedui, the Ambari, and the Allobroges, the insolence with which they boasted of their victory, their astonishment at his having so long put up with their outrages, pointed to the same conclusion. For it was the wont of the immortal gods sometimes to grant prosperity and long impunity to men whose crimes they were minded to punish, in order that a complete reverse of fortune might make them suffer more bitterly. Still, notwithstanding this, if they would give hostages to satisfy him that they intended to fulfill their promises, and if they would recompense the Aedui for the wrongs which they had done to them and their allies, and likewise the Allobroges, he would make peace with them. Divico replied that, as the Roman people could testify, the Helvetii, following the maxims of their ancestors, were in the habit of receiving hostages, not of giving them. With this rejoinder he withdrew. Next day the Helvetii quitted their encampment. Caesar did the same, and sent on ahead all his cavalry, amounting to 4,000, which he had raised from the whole province, from the Aedui, and from their allies, to see in what direction the enemy were going. Following the rearguard too eagerly, they engaged the Helvetian cavalry on unfavourable ground, and a few of our men fell. Elated at having repulsed such a numerous body of cavalry with 500 horsemen, the Helvetii more than once halted boldly, the rearguard challenging our men. Caesar would not allow his men to fight, and for the time he thought it enough to prevent the enemy from looting, foraging, and ravaging the country. The two armies marched in close company for about a fortnight, the enemy's rear and our van never being more than 5 or 6 miles apart. End of chapters 10 through 15. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Becky Cook. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar. Translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book 1, chapters 16 through 29. Meanwhile Caesar daily called upon the Aedui for the grain which, as he reminded them, they had promised in the name of their government. Gaul being situated, as the narrative has shown, beneath a northern sky, the climate is cold, and therefore not only was the standing corn unripe, but there was not even a sufficient supply of fodder. While Caesar was unable to use the grain which he had brought from the Saone in barges because the Helvetii had struck off from that river, and he was unwilling to move away from them. From day to day the Aedui kept him on the expectant, affirming that the grain was being collected, was on the way, was just at hand. When the day on which the men's rations would be due was near, feeling that his patience had been tried too long, he assembled their leading men, of whom he had a large number in camp. Amongst others, Diviciacus and Liscus, the chief magistrate, the Vergobret, as the Aedui call him, who is elected annually and possesses the power of life and death over his countrymen. Caesar took them seriously to task for not helping him in this critical conjuncture, when the enemy were near and it was impossible either to buy corn or to get it from the fields, especially as he had undertaken the campaign in compliance with the entreaties of many of their own representatives. But what he complained of more seriously still was that they had played him false. Caesar's words had their effect upon Liscus. He had before kept silence, but he now spoke out. There were certain individuals, he said, who had great influence with the masses, and unofficially had more power than the magistrates themselves. These men made seditious and violent speeches, and worked upon the fears of the people to prevent them from contributing their due quota of grain. It would be better, they argued, supposing that the Aedui could not for the moment win supremacy over Gaul, to have Gauls for their masters than Romans. And they had no doubt that, if the Romans overpowered the Helvetii, they would deprive the Aedui of their liberty, along with the rest of Gaul. These men kept the enemy informed of our plans, and of all that was going on in camp, and they were beyond his control. What was more, he knew that in making these revelations to Caesar, which he had only done under pressure, he had acted at great personal risk, and for that reason he kept silence as long as he could. Caesar perceived that Liscus' remarks pointed to Dumnorix, the brother of Diviciacus, but, as he did not want these matters to be talked about with a number of people present, he promptly dismissed the assembly, only detaining Liscus. When they were alone, he questioned him about what he had said in the meeting. Liscus spoke unreservedly and boldly. Caesar put the same questions to the others separately, and found that what Liscus said was true. The individual referred to was Dumnorix, a man of boundless audacity, extremely popular with the masses from his open-handedness, and an ardent revolutionary. For many years he had farmed at a low rate and monopolized the Aeduan tolls and all the other taxes, as, when he made a bid, no one dared to bid against him. In this way he had increased his fortune and amassed large sums to expend in bribery. He permanently maintained at his own expense a large body of horsemen, whom he kept in attendance upon him. He possessed great influence not only in his own country, but also with the surrounding tribes. And, to strengthen this influence, he had arranged a marriage for his mother with a Biturigian of the highest rank and highest authority, while his own wife was a Helvetian, and he had arranged marriages for his sisters on the mother's side and from his female relations amongst other tribes. From his connection with the Helvetii, he was a partisan of theirs and well disposed towards them, and he also personally detested Caesar and the Romans, because their coming had lessened his power and restored his brother Diviciacus to his former influential and honourable position. If anything should befall the Romans, he saw a great reason to hope that, by the aid of the Helvetii, he would secure the throne. While, so long as the Roman people were supreme, he despaired not only of making himself king, but even of retaining his existing influence. Caesar also found, in the course of his inquiries, that, in the disastrous cavalry combat a few days before, it was Dumnorix with his troopers, for he commanded the auxiliary cavalry which the Aedui had sent to Caesar, who had set the example of flight, and that on their flight the rest of the cavalry had taken alarm. Caesar's suspicions were now confirmed by positive facts. Dumnorix had opened the way for the Helvetii through the country of the Sequani. He had effected the interchange of hostages between the two peoples. He had done all this not only without the authority from himself or his own tribe, but actually without the knowledge of either, and his accuser was the chief magistrate of the Aedui. Having made these discoveries, Caesar thought there was sufficient ground for his either punishing him himself or calling upon the state to punish him. There was one objection. Caesar had come to know that Diviciacus, Dumnorix's brother, felt the utmost devotion to the Roman people and the utmost goodwill towards himself, and that his loyalty, equity, and good sense were quite exceptional. In fact, he was afraid of offending Diviciacus by punishing his brother. Accordingly, before taking any definite step, he sent for Diviciacus, and, dismissing the ordinary interpreters, conversed with him through the medium of Gaius Valerius Tricolus, a leading provincial and intimate friend of his own, whom he trusted absolutely in all matters. Reminding Diviciacus of what had been said about Dumnorix at the meeting when he was present, and at the same time telling him what everyone had separately said about him when alone with himself, he urgently requested him to consent to his either personally trying Dumnorix and passing judgment upon him, or else calling upon the state to do so and not to take offense. Bursting into tears, Diviciacus embraced Caesar and entreated him not to take severe measures against his brother. He knew, he said, that the story was true, and no one suffered more from his brother's conduct than himself, for at a time when his own influence was paramount with his countrymen and in the rest of Gaul, and his brother, on account of his youth, was powerless, the latter had risen through his support, and the resources and strength which he had thus acquired he used not only to weaken his influence, but almost to ruin him. Still, public opinion as well as fraternal affection had weight with him. If Dumnorix were severely dealt with by Caesar, then, considering his own friendly relations with the latter, no one would believe that he was not responsible, and the result would be that the feeling of the whole country would turn against him. He continued pleading at great length, and with tears when Caesar grasped his hand, reassured him, and begged him to say no more, telling him that he valued his friendship so highly, that, out of regard for his loyalty and his intercession, he would overlook both political injury and personal grievance. He then called Dumnorix, keeping his brother by, pointed out what he had to find fault with in his conduct, stated that he knew about him and the complaints which his own countrymen brought against him, warned him to avoid giving any ground for suspicion in the future, and told him that he would overlook the past for his brother Diviciacus' sake. Nevertheless, he placed Dumnorix under surveillance in order to ascertain what he was doing and who were his associates. On the same day Caesar was informed by his patrols that the enemy had encamped at the foot of a hill 8 miles from his own camp, and accordingly sent a party to reconnoitre the hill and find out what the ascent was like from the rear. They reported that it was quite practicable. In the third watch he explained his plans to Titus Labienus, his second in command, and ordered him to ascend to the summit of the hill with 2 legions. In the fourth watch he marched in person against the enemy, following the route by which they had advanced, and sending on all the cavalry in front. Publius Considius, who was considered a thorough soldier, and had served in the army of Lucius Sulla and afterwards in that of Marcus Crassus, was sent on in advance with patrols. At daybreak Labienus was in possession of the summit of the hill, while Caesar was not more than 1.5 miles from the enemy's camp, and, as he afterwards learned from his prisoners, his own approach and that of Labienus were alike unknown, when Considius rode up to him at full gallop and stated that the hill which he had desired Labienus to occupy was in possession of the enemy, as he could tell from the arms and crests being Gallic. Caesar withdrew his troops to a hill close by, and formed them in a line of battle. Labienus, acting on Caesar's order not to engage until he saw his force close to the enemy's camp, so that they might be attacked on all sides at once, kept possession of the hill, waiting for the appearance of our men, and declined an engagement. At length, late in the day, Caesar learned from his patrols that the hill was in the possession of his own troops, that the Helvetii had moved off, and that Considius, from panic, had reported as a fact actually seen what he had not seen at all. The same day Caesar followed the enemy at the usual interval, and pitched his camp 3 miles from theirs. Next day, as the rations of the army would be due in just 48 hours, and he was not more than 18 miles from Bibracte, by far the wealthiest and most important town of the Aedui, he thought it time to secure his supplies, and accordingly struck off from the route followed by the Helvetii and marched rapidly for Bibracte. The move was reported to the enemy by deserters from Lucius Aemilius, who had commanded a troop of Gallic cavalry. The Helvetii, believing that the Romans were moving away because they were afraid of them, especially as on the day before, though they had occupied a position of vantage, they had declined in action, or confident of being able to cut them off from supplies, altered their plans, reversed their march, and began to hang upon our rearguard and harass them. Observing this, Caesar withdrew his troops on a hill close by and sent his cavalry to stem the enemy's attacks. Meanwhile, he formed his 4 veteran legions in 3 lines halfway up the hill, posting the 2 which he had recently levied on Cisalpine Gaul and all the auxiliaries above on the ridge, and thus occupying the whole hill. At the same time, he ordered the men's packs to be collected and the space which they covered to be entrenched by the troops posted on the high ground. The Helvetii, following with all their wagons, parked their baggage, repulsed our cavalry with their dense array, and forming a phalanx, moved up against our first line. Caesar sent his first own charger and then the chargers of all the officers out of sight, in order, by putting all on an equality, to banish the idea of flight. Then he harangued his men, and the battle began. The legionaries, throwing their javelins from their commanding position, easily broke the enemy's phalanx, and having destroyed their formation, drew their swords and charged. The Gauls were greatly hampered in action by the fact that in many cases several shields were transfixed and pinned together by the impact of one javelin, and, as the iron bent, they could not pull the javelins out, or fight properly with their left arms encumbered, so that many, after the repeated jerks, preferred to drop their shields and fight bare. At length, enfeebled by wounds, they began to fall back and retreat towards a hill about a mile off. They had gained the hill, and the Romans were following after them, when the Boii and the Tulingi, some 15,000 strong, who closed the enemy's columns and served as the rear guard, marched up, immediately attacked the Romans on their exposed flank, and lapped round them. Observing this, the Helvetii, who had retreated to the hill, began to press forward again, and renewed the battle. The Romans effected a change of front and advanced in 2 divisions, the first and second lines to oppose the enemy whom they had beaten and driven off, the third to withstand the newcomers. Thus 2 battles went on at once, and the fighting was prolonged and fierce. When the enemy could no longer withstand the onslaughts of the Romans, 1 division drew back, in continuation of the original movement, up the hill, while the other withdrew to the baggage and wagons. Withdrew, not fled, for throughout the whole of this battle, though the fighting lasted from the 7th hour till evening, none could see an enemy in flight. Till far into the night fighting actually went on by the baggage, for the enemy had made a rampart of their wagons, and from their commanding position hurled missiles against our men as they came up, while some got between the wagons, and behind the wheels, and threw darts and javelins, which wounded our men. After a long struggle our men took possession of the baggage and the laager. Orgetorix's daughter and one of his sons were captured on the spot. About 130,000 souls survived the battle, and fled without halting throughout the whole of that night. 3 days later they reached the country of the Lingones, for our troops remained on the field for 3 days, out of consideration for their wounded, and to bury the dead, and therefore were unable to pursue. Caesar sent dispatches and messages to the Lingones, warning them not to supply the fugitives with corn or otherwise assist them, and threatening that, if they did so, he would treat them as he had treated the Helvetii. After an interval of 3 days he started with his whole force in pursuit. The Helvetii, under stress of utter destitution, sent envoys to Caesar to propose surrender. The envoys met him on the march, prostrated themselves before him, and in some pliant terms besought him with tears for peace. He told them that the fugitives must remain where they were and await his arrival, and they promised obedience. When Caesar reached the spot, he required the Helvetii to give hostages and to surrender their arms and the slaves who had deserted to them. While the hostages and deserters were being searched for and the arms collected, night came on, and about 6,000 men, belonging to the clan known as the Bergini, quitted the Helvetian encampment in the early part of the night and pushed on for the Rhine and the territory of the Germans. Either they were afraid that after surrendering their arms they would be punished, or they hoped to get off scot-free, believing that, as the number which had surrendered was so vast, their flight might escape detection or even remain entirely unnoticed. When Caesar discovered this, he ordered the peoples through whose territories they had gone to hunt them down and bring them back if they wished him to hold them guiltless. When they were brought back he treated them as enemies, but all the rest, after they had delivered up hostages, arms, and deserters, he admitted to surrender. He ordered the Helvetii, the Tulingi, and the Laudobrigi to return to their own country, whence they had come, and, as all their corn and pulse were gone, and they had not in their own country the means of satisfying their hunger, He directed the Allobroges to supply them with corn, and ordered them to rebuild the towns and villages which they had burned. His chief reason for doing this was that he did not wish the region which the Helvetii had abandoned to remain uninhabited, lest the Germans, who dwelt on the further side of the Rhine, might be induced by the fertility of the land to migrate from their own country into theirs, and establish themselves in proximity to the province of Gaul, and especially to Allobroges. The Aedui begged to be allowed to find room for the Boii within their own country, as they were a people of eminent and proved courage, and Caesar granted their request. The Aedui assigned them lands, and afterwards admitted them to the enjoyment of the rights and liberties on an equality with their own. Documents, written in Greek characters, were found in the encampment of the Helvetii and brought to Caesar. They contained a schedule, giving the names of individuals, the number of emigrants capable of bearing arms, and likewise, under separate heads, the numbers of old men, women, and children. The aggregate amount to 263,000 Helvetii, 36,000 Tulingi, 13,000 Latobrigi, 23,000 Rauraci, and 32,000 Boii. The number capable of bearing arms was 92,000, and the grand total 368,000. A census was taken, by Caesar's orders, of those who had returned home, and the number was found to be 110,000. End of chapters 16 through 29. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. To find out more, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Becky Cook. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar. Translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book 1, chapters 30 through 41. On the conclusion of the campaign against the Helvetii, envoys from almost every part of Gaul, the leading men of their respective tribes, came to congratulate Caesar. They were aware, they said, that, if he had exacted atonement from the Helvetii by the sword for the wrongs they had done in the past to the Roman people, yet his action was just as much to the advantage of the Gaul as of the Romans. For though the Helvetii were perfectly well off, they had quitted their own abode with the intention of attacking the whole of Gaul, usurping dominion, selecting for occupation out of numerous tracts the one which they deemed the most suitable and the most fertile in the whole country, and making the other tribes their tributaries. The envoys begged to be allowed to convene, with Caesar's express sanction, a pan-Gallic council for a particular day, representing that they had certain favours to ask of him after their substance was unanimously agreed upon. Their request being granted, they fixed a date for the council, and bound themselves mutually by oath not to disclose its proceedings without official sanction. After the council had broken up, the tribal leaders who had been closeted with Caesar before returned, and asked permission to discuss with him privately, in a place secluded from observation, matters which concerned their own and the commonwealth. The request being acceded to, they all prostrated themselves with tears at Caesar's feet. They told him that it was their aim and endeavour to prevent what they said from being disclosed, no less than to obtain the favours they desired, because they saw that if they were disclosed, they would incur the most cruel punishment. Their spokesman was the Aeduan Diviciacus. Gaul, he said, comprised as a whole two rival groups, the Aedui being the overlords of one, and the Arverni of the other. The two tribes had been struggling hard for supremacy for many years, when it happened that the Arverni and the Sequani hired Germans to join them. About 15,000 had crossed the Rhine in the first instance, but the rude barbarians conceived a passion for the lands, the civilization, and the wealth of the Gauls, and afterwards more crossed over, the number at that time in Gaul amounting to 20,000. The Aedui and their dependents had encountered them repeatedly, and had been beaten, and had suffered a great disaster, losing all their men of rank, all their council, and all their knighthood. Overwhelmed by these disastrous defeats, they, whose prowess and whose hospitable and amicable relations with the Roman people had before made them supreme in Gaul, had been forced to give as hostages to the Sequani, their most illustrious citizens, and to bind the tribe by oath not to attempt to recover the hostages or to solicit aid from the Roman people, and to remain for ever without demur beneath the sovereign powers of their conquerors. He himself was the only man of the whole Aeduan community who could not be prevailed upon to take the oath or to give his children as hostages. He had therefore fled from his country and gone to Rome to claim assistance from the Senate, because he alone was not bound either by oath or surrender of hostages. A worse fate, however, had befallen the victorious Sequani than the beaten Aedui, for Ariovistus, king of the Germans, had settled in their country and seized 1/3 of the Sequanian territory, the best land in the whole of Gaul. And now he insisted that the Sequani should quit another third, because a few months previously 24,000 Herudes had joined him, and he had to find a place for them to settle in. Within a few years the whole population of Gaul would be expatriated, and the Germans would all cross the Rhine, for there was no comparison between the land of the Gauls and that of the Germans, or between the standard of living of the former and that of the latter. Ariovistus, having defeated the united Gallic forces in one battle which took place at Magdeburg, was exercising his authority with arrogance and cruelty, demanding from every man of rank his children as hostages, and inflicting upon them all kinds of cruel punishments if the least intimation of his will were not obeyed. The man was a ferocious, headstrong savage, and it was impossible to endure his dictation any longer. Unless Caesar and the Roman people could help them, the Gauls must all do as the Helvetii had done, leave house and home, seek another abode, other settlements out of reach of the Germans, and take their chance of whatever might befall them. If his words were reported to Ariovistus, he had no doubt that he would inflict the heaviest penalty upon all the hostages in his keeping. Caesar, by his prestige and that of his army, or by his late victory, or by the weight of the Roman name, could deter any fresh host of Germans from crossing the Rhine, and protect the whole of Gaul from the outrageous conduct of Ariovistus. After Diviciacus had made his speech, all who were present began to weep bitterly and to entreat Caesar for help. He noticed that the Sequani alone did not behave like the rest, but remained mournfully looking down, with heads bowed. In astonishment he asked them what was the reason of this behaviour. The Sequani made no reply, but remained without uttering in the same mournful mood. After he had questioned them repeatedly, without being able to get a single word out of them, the Aeduan Diviciacus again answered. The lot of the Sequani, he explained, was more pitiable and more grievous than that of the others, because they alone dared, not even in secret, complain or implore help, and though Ariovistus was away, they dreaded his cruelty just as much as if he were there, confronting them, for while the others had at any rate the chance of escape, the Sequani, having admitted Ariovistus within their territories, and all their strongholds being in his power, would have to submit to every form of cruel punishment. On learning these facts, Caesar reassured the Gauls, and promised to give the matter his attention, remarking that he had every hope that Ariovistus, in return for his kindness and in deference to his authority, would cease his outrages. When he had finished speaking, he dismissed the assembly. Besides these considerations, indeed, many circumstances forced upon him the conviction that this problem must be faced and solved. First of all, there was the fact that the Aedui, who had repeatedly been recognized as brethren, indeed kinsmen, by the Senate, were held in subjection under the sway of the Germans, while their hostages, as he knew, were detained by Ariovistus and the Sequani. And this, considering the great power of the Roman people, he regarded as an extreme disgrace to himself and his country. Besides that the Germans should insensibly form the habit of crossing the Rhine and enter Gaul in the large numbers was, he saw, fraught with danger to the Roman people. He believed, too, that being fierce barbarians, they would not stop short when they had taken possession of the whole of Gaul, but would pass on into the province, as the Cimbri and Teutoni had done before them, and thence push on into Italy, especially as the Sequani were only separated from our province by the Rhone, and he thought it essential to obviate this danger at the earliest possible moment. Moreover, Ariovistus himself had assumed an inflated and arrogant demeanour which made him quite insufferable. Accordingly, Caesar decided to send envoys to Ariovistus, requesting him to name some spot midway between their respective quarters for a conference, and saying that he wished to discuss with him political affairs and matters of the utmost importance to both parties. Ariovistus told the envoys in reply that, if he had wanted anything from Caesar, he would have gone to him in person, and if Caesar wanted anything from him, he must come to him. Besides, he could not venture to go without his army into the districts occupied by Caesar, and he could not concentrate his army without collecting a large quantity of stores, which would involve great labour. Moreover, he was at a loss to understand what business Caesar, or for that matter the Roman people, had in his part of Gaul, which he had conquered by the sword. When this reply was conveyed to Caesar, he again sent envoys to Ariovistus with the following message. Ariovistus had been treated with great kindness by himself and by the Roman people, having, in his consulship, received from the Senate the titles of king and friend. Since he showed his gratitude to himself and the Roman people by raising objections when invited to a conference, and refusing to make any statement or to inform himself about matters which concerned them both, these were Caesar's demands. First, he must not bring any additional body of men across the Rhine into Gaul. Secondly, he must restore the hostages belonging to the Aedui, authorize the Sequani to restore theirs. Furthermore, he must not provoke the Aedui by outrages, or attack them, or their allies. If he complied, Caesar and the Roman people would be bound to him by lasting goodwill and amity. If not, then, in accordance with the resolution which the Senate had passed in the consulship of Marcus Messala and Marcus Piso, that the governor of Gaul for the time being should, so far as the public interest would permit, protect the Aedui and the other friends of the Roman people, Caesar would not suffer the wrongs of the Aedui to go unavenged. Ariovistus replied that the rights of war entitled conquerors to dictate their own terms to the conquered. The Roman people acted on the same principle. They regularly dealt with the conquered peoples, not in obedience to the mandate of a third party, but according to their own judgment. If he did not dictate to the Roman people how they should exercise their rights, the Roman people ought not to interfere with him in the exercise of his. The Aedui had become his tributaries because they tempted the fortune of war, fought, and suffered defeat. Caesar was doing him a serious injury, for his coming depreciated the tribute. He would not restore the Aedui their hostages, but neither would he attack them or their allies wantonly if they abided by their agreement and paid their tribute annually. If not, much good would the title of Brethren of the Roman people do them. As for Caesar's threat, that he would not suffer the wrongs of the Aedui to go unavenged, no man had ever fought Ariovistus and escaped destruction. Let Caesar come on when he liked. He would then appreciate the mettle of the Germans, who had never known defeat, whose lives had been passed in war, and who, for 14 years, had never sheltered beneath a roof. Simultaneously with the delivery of this message, envoys came to Caesar from the Aedui and the Treveri, the Aedui to complain that the Harudes, who had recently migrated into Gaul, were devastating their territory, and that even the surrender of hostages had failed to purchase the forbearance of Ariovistus, while the Treveri announced that 100 clans of the Suebi, commanded by two brothers, Nasua and Symbarius, had established themselves on the banks of the Rhine, intending to attempt a passage. Caesar was seriously alarmed. He considered it necessary to act at once, lest if a fresh horde of Suebi joined Ariovistus's veteran force, it might be harder to cope with him. Accordingly, he arranged as quickly as possible for a supply of grain and advanced against Ariovistus by forced marches. After a march of 3 days, he received news that Ariovistus was hurrying with all his forces to seize Vesontio, the largest town of the Sequani, and had advanced 3 days' journey beyond his own frontier. Caesar felt it necessary to make a great effort to forestall him, for the town was well provided with military material of every kind, and its natural strength made it a most valuable military possession. The river Doubs winding round in a course that might have been traced with a compass, and almost surrounding the stronghold. The remaining space, not more than 1,600 feet where the river left a gap, was occupied by a hill of great elevation, the banks of the river on either side touching the base of the hill. The hill itself was converted into a citadel by a wall, which surrounded it and connected it with the town. Caesar pushed on by forced marches day and night, took possession of, and garrisoned the town. While he was halting for a few days close to Vesontio to collect corn and other supplies, a violent panic suddenly seized the whole army, completely paralyzing everyone's judgment and nerve. It arose from the inquisitiveness of our men and the chatter of the Gauls and the traders, who affirmed that the Germans were men of huge stature, incredible valor, and practiced skill in war. Many a time they had themselves come across them, and had not been able even to look them in the face or meet the glare of their piercing eyes. The panic began with the tribunes, the auxiliary officers, and others who had left the capital to follow Caesar in the hope of winning his favor, and had little experience in war. Some of them applied for leave of absence, alleging various urgent requests for their departure, though a good many, anxious to avoid the imputation of cowardice, stayed behind for very shame. They were unable, however, to assume an air of unconcern, and sometimes even to restrain their tears. Shutting themselves up in their tents, they bemoaned their own fate or talked dolefully with their intimates of the peril that threatened the army. All over the camp men were making their wills. Gradually, even legionaries, centurions, and cavalry officers, who had long experience of campaigning, were unnerved by these alarmists. Those who did not want to be thought cowards said that it was not the enemy they were afraid of, but the narrow roads and the huge forests which separated them from Ariovistus, or the difficulty of bringing up grain. Some actually told Caesar that when he gave the order to strike the camp in advance, the men would not obey, and would be too terrified to move. Observing the state of affairs, Caesar called a meeting, to which the centurions of all grades were summoned, and rated them severely for presuming to suppose that it was their business to inquire or even to consider where they were going or on what errand. When he was consul, Ariovistus had eagerly solicited the friendship of the Roman people. Why, then, should any one suppose that he would abandon his loyal attitude in this harebrained way? For his own part, he was convinced that when he came to know his demands and realized the fairness of his terms, he would not reject his friendship or that of the Roman people. But supposing he were carried away by mad passion and went to war, what on earth was there to fear? Or why should they distrust their own courage and his generalship? The measure of their enemy had been taken at a time when their fathers could remember, when the Cimbri and Teutoni were defeated by Gaius Marius, and the army confessedly earned no less credit than their commander. And again in recent years in Italy during the slave war, although slaves were, in some measure, helped by the experience and discipline which they had learned from us. This war enabled one to appreciate the value of steadfastness, for the men whom the Romans had long dreaded without reason, while they were without arms, they afterwards overcame when they were armed and flushed with victory. Finally, these Germans were the same whom the Helvetii had many times encountered, not only in their own, but in German territory, and generally beaten. Yet the Helvetii were no match for our army. Those who were alarmed by the defeat and rout of the Gauls could ascertain, if they inquired, that the Gauls were tired out by the long duration of the war, and that Ariovistus, after keeping himself shut up for many months in an encampment protected by marshes without giving them a chance of attacking him, suddenly fell upon them when they had dispersed in despair of bringing him to action, and beat them by craft and stratagem rather than by valor. Ariovistus himself could not expect that Roman armies were to be trapped by the craft for which there had been an opening against the simple natives. Those who pretended that their cowardice was only anxiety about supplies and the nearer roads were guilty of presumption, for it was evident that they had either no confidence in their general's sense of duty or meant to lecture him. These things were his business. The Sequani, the Luci, and the Lingones were providing grain, and the corn in the fields was already ripe. About the road they would shortly judge for themselves. As to the report, they did not intend to obey orders in advance, that did not trouble him at all, for he knew that generals whose armies mutinied were either bunglers whose luck had deserted them, or had been detected in some scandalous crime, and thereby convicted of avarice. The whole tenor of his life proved his integrity, and the war with the Helvetii his good fortune. Accordingly, he intended to do at once what he would otherwise have postponed. On the following night, in the 4th watch, he should strike his camp, so as to find out as soon as possible whether honor and duty or cowardice were the stronger motive with them. If no one else would follow him, he would go on alone with the 10th legion, in which he had full confidence, and it should be his bodyguard. This legion Caesar had always treated with special favor, and, on account of its soldierly spirit, he trusted it in the highest degree. After this speech a marvelous change came over the temper of all ranks, and with the utmost ardor and eagerness for action took possession of them. The 10th legion, taking the initiative, conveyed their thanks to Caesar through their tribunes for having expressed such a high opinion of them, and declared themselves perfectly ready to take the field. Following their lead, the other legions deputed their tribunes and chief centurions to make their apologies to Caesar, protesting that they had never hesitated or been afraid, and that they recognized that it was their general's business and not theirs to direct the campaign. Their excuses were accepted. By the aid of Diviciacus, in whom he had more confidence than in any of the other Gauls, Caesar had discovered a route which, though it would involve making a detour of more than 50 miles, would enable him to march through open country. He kept his word and started in the 4th watch. After a continuous march of 7 days, he was informed by his patrols that Ariovistus's forces were 24 miles from ours. End of Book 1, Chapters 30 through 41. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Becky Cook. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar. Translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book 1, chapters 42 through 54. On learning of Caesar's arrival, Ariovistus sent envoys to say that, since he had come nearer, and his own safety would probably not be imperiled, he would not oppose his original request for an interview. Caesar did not spurn his offer, believing that he was now returning to reason, as he offered of his own accord to do what he had refused before when he was asked. And he entertained a strong hope that when he learned his demands, he would, in consideration of the great favours conferred upon him by himself and the Roman people, abandon his stubborn attitude. The interview was fixed for the 4th day following. Meanwhile, envoys were frequently passing to and fro between the two generals. Ariovistus insisted that Caesar should not bring any infantry to the conference, as he was afraid he might treacherously surround him. They must each come with a mounted escort, otherwise he would not come at all. Caesar, not wishing any obstacle to stand in the way and stop the conference, and fearing to trust his life to Gallic cavalry, decided that his best plan would be to dismount all the Gallic troopers and mount the infantry of the 10th Legion, in whom he had the greatest confidence, on their horses, so that, in case it were necessary to act, he might have an escort on whose devotion he could absolutely rely. On this, one of the soldiers of the 10th remarked with a touch of humour, "Caesar is better than his word. He promised to make the 10th his bodyguard, and now he's knighting us." There was a great plain, in which was an earthen mound of considerable size, about equidistant from the camps of Ariovistus and of Caesar. To this spot they came, as agreed, to hold the conference. Caesar posted the mounted legion, which he had brought with him, 400 paces from the mound, and Ariovistus's horsemen took up a position at the same distance. Ariovistus stipulated that he and Caesar should confer on horseback, each accompanied by 10 men. When they reached the spot, Caesar began by recalling the kindness with which he himself and the Senate had treated Ariovistus. The Senate had conferred upon him the titles of king and friend, and the handsomest presents had been sent to him. Such a mark of favour, he told him, had fallen to the lot of few, and was usually bestowed only as a reward for great services. Ariovistus had no right to approach the Senate and no title to claim anything, and it was the kindness and generosity of himself and the Senate that he owed these distinctions. Caesar explained further that between the Romans and the Aedui there were long-standing and solid grounds of intimacy. Senatorial resolutions, couched in the most complimentary terms, had repeatedly been passed in their favour, and at all times, even before they had sought our friendship, the Aedui had held the foremost position in the whole of Gaul. As a matter of settled policy, the Roman people desired their allies and friends not only to lose nothing by the connection, but to be gainers in influence, dignity, and consideration. Who then could suffer them to be robbed of what they already possessed when they sought the friendship of the Roman people? Caesar then repeated the demands which he had charged his envoys to present: that Ariovistus should not make war upon the Aedui or upon their allies, that he should restore the hostages, and that, if he were unable to send back any of the Germans to their own country, he should at all events not suffer any more to cross the Rhine. Ariovistus said little in reply to Caesar's demands, but spoke at great length about his own merits. He said that he had not crossed the Rhine spontaneously, but in response to the urgent request of the Gauls. He had not left home and kinsmen without great expectations and great inducements. Possessions which he occupied in Gaul had been ceded to him by the Gauls, their hostages had been given voluntarily, while by the rights of war he made them pay the tribute which conquerors habitually exacted from the conquered. He had not made war upon the Gauls had made war upon him. The tribes of Gaul had all come to attack him, and kept the field against him, and he had beaten the whole host in a single battle and crushed them. If they wanted to try again, he was ready for another fight. If they wanted peace, it was not fair of them to refuse their tribute, which they had hitherto paid of their own free will. The friendship of the Roman people ought to be a distinction and a protection, not a drawback, and it was with that expectation that he had sought it. If through their interference his tribute were stopped and those who had surrendered to him withdrawn from his control, he would be just as ready to discard their friendship as he had been to ask for it. If he continued to bring Germans in large numbers into Gaul, he did so not for aggression, but in self-defense. The proof was that he had not come till he was asked, and that he had not attacked but only repelled attack. He had come to Gaul before the Romans. Never till now had a Roman army stirred outside the frontier of the province of Gaul. What did Caesar mean by invading his dominions? This part of Gaul was his province, just as the other was ours. If he made a raid into our territory, we should be wrong to give in to him. Similarly, it was unjust of us to obstruct him in his rightful sphere. Caesar said that the Aedui had been given the title of brethren by the Senate, but he was not such an oaf, he was not so ignorant of the world as not to know that in the late war with the Allobroges the Aedui had not helped the Romans, and that in the struggle which with the Aedui had had with himself and the Sequani they had not had the benefit of Roman aid. He was bound to suspect that Caesar, under the mask of friendship, was keeping his army in Gaul to ruin him. Unless he took his departure and withdrew his army from the neighbourhood, he should treat him not as a friend but as an enemy. In fact, if he put him to the death, he should be doing an acceptable service to many of the nobles and leading men of Rome. This he knew as a fact, for he had it through their agents from their own lips, and he could purchase the gratitude and friendship of them all by killing him. If, on the other hand, he withdrew and left him in undisturbed possession of Gaul, he would reward him handsomely, and whenever he had occasion to go to war, he would fight all his battles for him, and save him all trouble and risk. Caesar spoke at considerable length, the gist of his speech being that he could not abandon his undertaking, that his own principles, and those of the Roman people, would not allow him to forsake deserving allies, and that he could not admit that Gaul belonged to Ariovistus any more than to the Roman people. The Arverni and the Ruteni had been conquered by Quintus Fabius Maximus, but the Roman people had granted them an amnesty, and had not annexed their country or imposed tribute upon them. If priority of occupation were to be considered, the title of the Roman people to dominion in Gaul was unimpeachable. If they were to abide by the decision of the Senate, Gaul had a right to independence, for the Senate, although it had conquered Gaul, had granted it autonomy. While these questions were being argued, Caesar was informed that Ariovistus's horsemen were moving nearer the mound, riding towards our men and throwing stones and other missiles at them. Caesar ceased speaking, went back to his men, and ordered them not to retaliate, for although he saw that the legion of his choice would run no risk in engaging the cavalry, he did not choose, by beating the enemy, to let it be said that he had pledged his word and then surrounded them while a conference was going on. When the news spread to the ranks that Ariovistus, in the course of the conference, had arrogantly denied the right of the Romans to be in Gaul, and that his cavalry had attacked our troops, thereby breaking off the conference, the army was inspired with an intenser enthusiasm and eagerness for battle. 2 days later Ariovistus sent envoys to Caesar, saying that he desired to confer with him on the questions which they had begun to discuss without reaching any conclusion. Let Caesar either name another day for a conference, or, if he were disinclined to do that, send one of his officers to represent him. Caesar saw no reason for further discussion, especially as on the preceding day the Germans could not be prevented from throwing missiles at our men, while to send a representative would be very dangerous, and would be placing him at the mercy of savages. The best course appeared to be to send Gaius Valerius Procillus, son of Gaius Valerius Caburus, a young man of the highest character and a true gentleman, whose father had been enfranchised by Gaius Valerius Flaccus. He selected him because he could be thoroughly trusted, and because he knew Gallic, which Ariovistus, from long practice, now spoke fluently, and also because, in his case, the Germans had no motive for foul play. With him he sent Marcus Metius, who was on friendly terms with Ariovistus. Their instructions were to hear what Ariovistus had to say and report to him. When Ariovistus caught sight of them close by, in his camp, he roared out before the troops, "What are you coming to me for? To play the spy?" When they attempted to speak, he silenced them and put them in irons. On the same day he advanced and took up a position 6 miles from Caesar's camp at the foot of a hill. The following day he marched his force past Caesar's camp and encamped 2 miles beyond, with the intention of cutting him off from the corn and other supplies which were being brought up from the territories of the Sequani and Aedui. On each of the 5 following days Caesar regularly led his troops in front of his camp and kept them in line of battle, to give Ariovistus the chance of fighting if he wished. During all this time Ariovistus kept his army shut up in camp, but skirmished daily with his cavalry. The mode of fighting practiced by the German was as follows. They had 6,000 cavalry, with the same number of infantry, swift runners, of extraordinary courage, each one of whom had been selected by one of the cavalry out of the whole host for his own protection. The cavalry were accompanied by them in action, and regularly fell back upon their support. In case of a check, they flocked to the rescue. Whenever a trooper was severely wounded and fell from his horse, they rallied round him, and they had acquired such speed by training that if it was necessary to make a forced march or retreat rapidly, they supported themselves by the horses' manes and kept pace with them. Seeing that Ariovistus meant to keep within his camp, and being resolved to reopen communication with his convoys without delay, Caesar selected a suitable position for camp about 1200 paces beyond the spot where the Germans were encamped, and advanced to this position in 3 columns. Keeping the first and second under arms, he ordered the third to construct a camp. The site, as I have said, was about 1200 paces from the enemy. Ariovistus sent about 16,000 light infantry with all his cavalry to overawe our men and prevent them from completing the entrenchment. Nevertheless, Caesar, adhering to his original resolve, ordered the first 2 lines to keep the enemy at bay, while the third finished the entrenchment. When the camp was entrenched, he left 2 legions and a detachment of auxiliaries to hold it, and withdrew the remaining 4 to the larger camp. Next day Caesar, according to his regular practice, made his troops move out of both camps and, advancing a short distance from the larger one, formed a line of battle and gave the enemy an opening for attack. Seeing that they would not come out even then, he withdrew his army into camp about midday. Then at last Ariovistus sent a detachment to attack the smaller camp. Fighting was kept up with spirit on both sides till evening. At sunset Ariovistus led back his forces, which had inflicted heavy loss upon the Romans and suffered heavily themselves, into camp. On inquiring from prisoners why he would not fight a decisive battle, Caesar found that the reason was this. Among the Germans it was customary for the matrons to tell by lots and divinations whether it would be advantageous to fight or not, and their decision was that it was not fated that the Germans should gain the victory if they fought before the new moon. Next day Caesar left detachments of adequate strength to guard the 2 camps, posted all his auxiliaries in view of the enemy, in front of the smaller one, with the object of creating a moral effect, as his regular infantry, compared with the enemy, were numerically rather weak, and, forming his army in 3 lines, advanced right up to the enemy's camp. Then at last the Germans perforce led the troops out of camp, formed them up at equal intervals in tribal groups, Herodes, Marcomanni, Triboci, Vegiones, Nemetes, Seduci, and Suebi, and closed their whole line with wagons and carts to do away with all hope of escape. In the wagons they placed their women, who, as they were marching out to battle, stretched out their hands and besought them with tears not to deliver them into bondage to the Romans. Caesar placed each of his generals and his quaestor in command of a legion, so that every man might feel that his courage would be recognized and engaged with the White Ring, which he commanded in person, for he observed that troops which faced it were the weakest part of the enemy line. When the signal was given, our men charged the enemy line with such vigor, and the enemy dashed forward so suddenly and so swiftly that there was no time to hurl the javelins at them. The men therefore dropped their javelins and fought hand to hand with swords. The Germans, however, rapidly formed in a phalanx, the usual order, and thus sustained the impact of our swords. Many of our men actually leaped onto the flanks, tore the shields out of the enemy's hand, and stabbed them from above. On the left wing the enemy's line was beaten and put to flight, but on the right their greatest numbers enabled them to press our line very hard. Noticing this, the younger Publius Crassus, who commanded the cavalry, and was more free to observe and act than the officers who engaged in the actual fighting, sent the 3rd line to the relief of our hard-pressed troops. Thus the battle was restored, and the enemy all turned tail and did not cease their flight until they reached the Rhine, about 5 miles from the battlefield. A few, trusting their strong limbs, struck out and swam across. A few found boats and saved themselves. Among the latter was Ariovistus, who found a skiff moored by the bank and escaped in it. All the rest were hunted down by our cavalry and slain. Ariovistus had 2 wives, one a Sueban by birth, whom he had brought with him from his own country, the other a Norican, a sister of King Voccio, who had been sent to him by her brother and whom he had married in Gaul. Both of them perished in the rout. He also had 2 daughters, one of whom was killed and the other captured. Gaius Valerius Procillus was being dragged along among the fugitives by his warders, fettered with 3 chains, when he fell in with Caesar, who was leading the cavalry in pursuit of the enemy. To see this excellent provincial, his own familiar friend, rescued from the enemy's clutches and restored to him, and to feel that fortune had not brought upon him any calamity that could lessen the pleasure of victory upon which he might fairly congratulate himself, these things gave Caesar no less pleasure than the victory itself. Procillus said that, in his own presence, they had cast lots 3 times to see whether he should be burned alive at once or kept for execution later, and happily the lots had so fallen that he was safe. Marcus Metius also was found and brought back to Caesar. When the result of the battle was made known beyond the Rhine, the Suebi, who had reached the banks of the river, turned homewards. The Ubii, who lived in the immediate neighbourhood of the Rhine, seeing their alarm, pursued them and killed a large number. Having finished 2 important campaigns in a single summer, Caesar led his army back to winter in the country of the Sequani a little before the usual time, and placing Labienus in command of the camp, started for Cisalpine Gaul to hold the assizes. End of Book 1, Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar, translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. End of chapters 42 through 54.
Book 2, Chapters 1 through 15 of Commentaries on the Gallic War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar, translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book 2, Chapter 1. The first campaign against the Belgae. While Caesar, as we have mentioned above, was wintering in Cisalpine Gaul, frequent rumors reached him, which were confirmed by dispatches from Labienus, that the Belgae, whose territory, as we have remarked, forms a third part of Gaul, were all conspiring against the Roman people, and exchanging hostages. The motives of the conspiracy, it appeared, were these. First, the Belgae were afraid that, as the whole of Gaul was tranquilized, our army might advance against them. Secondly, they were egged on by sundry Gauls, some of whom, just as they had objected to the continuing presence of the Germans in Gaul, were irritated by the Roman army wintering in the country and settling there, while others, from instability and fickleness of temperament, hankered after a change of masters, and also by powerful individuals, especially those who had the means of hiring mercenaries, who, as often happened in Gaul, had been wont to usurp royal authority, and found it less easy to achieve this end under our dominion. Alarmed by these messages and dispatches, Caesar raised 2 new legions in Cisalpine Gaul, and directed Quintus Pedius, one of his generals, to lead them, at the beginning of the fine weather, into further Gaul. As soon as forage began to be plentiful, he joined the army in person, and charged the Senones and the other Gauls who were conterminous with the Belgae to find out what was going on in their country, and to keep him informed. They all agreed in reporting that levies were being raised, and that an army was concentrating. Caesar now thought it his duty to march against them without hesitation. After arranging for a supply of grain, he broke up his camp, and reached the Belgic frontier in about a fortnight. He arrived unexpectedly, and sooner than anyone had anticipated. The Remi, the nearest of the Belgae to Gaul, sent Iccius and Andecumborius, the leading men of the tribe, as envoys, to say that they would place their lives and all that they possessed under the protection and at the disposal of the Roman people, that they had not shared the counsels of the other Belgae, or joined the conspiracy against the Roman people, and that they were prepared to give hostages, and to obey orders, to admit the Romans into their strongholds, and to supply them with corn and other necessaries. That all the other Belgae were in arms, and that the Germans who dwelt on the near side of the Rhine had joined them, and that they were all possessed by such frenzy that the Remi could not deter even the Suessiones, their own kith and kin, who had the same rights and laws as themselves, and jointly owned the authority of one and the same magistrate, from taking their side. On inquiring from the envoys the names of the belligerent tribes, their size, and their military strength, Caesar collected the following information. Most of the Belgae were of German origin, and had crossed the Rhine at a remote period, and settled in Gaul on account of the fertility of the land. They had driven out the Gallic inhabitants, and were the only people who, at the time within the memory of our fathers, when the whole of Gaul was devastated, prevented the Teutoni and the Cimbri from invading their country. Inspired by the memory of that achievement, they arrogated to themselves great authority, and assumed the air of a great military power. With regard to their numbers, the Remi professed to have full information, for, being allied to them by blood and intermarriage, they had ascertained the strength of the contingent which each tribe had promised in the general council of the Belgae for the impending war. The Bellovaci, who from their valor, prestige, and numbers were the most powerful of all, and could muster 100,000 armed men, had promised 60,000 picked troops, and claimed the general direction of the campaign. The Suessiones were their own neighbours, and their territory was very extensive and very fertile. Within the memory of men still living, their king had been Diviciacus, the most powerful prince in the whole of Gaul, who was overlord not only of a large part of the Belgic territory, but also of Britain. The reigning king was Galba, who, on account of his integrity and sound judgment, was unanimously entrusted with the chief command. The Suessiones possessed 12 strongholds, and promised 50,000 armed men. The same number was promised by the Nervii, who were considered by the Belgae themselves as the fiercest of them all, and who were the most remote. The Atrebates promised 15,000, the Ambiani 10,000, the Menapii 7,000, the Caleti 10,000, the Veliocases and the Viromandui jointly the same number, and the Aduatuci 19,000, the Condrusi, the Eburones, the Cairoisi, and the Paimani, who were known by the common appellation of Germans, promised, so the Remi believed, about 40,000. Caesar addressed the Remi in encouraging and in gracious terms, and ordered their entire council to meet him, and the children of the leading men to be brought to him as hostages. All these orders they carefully and punctually obeyed. He then earnestly impressed upon the Aeduan Diviciacus that it was most important in the interest of the Republic, and indeed of the Aeduans and Romans alike, to break up the enemy's forces, so as to avoid the necessity of engaging such a powerful host at once. The object could be attained if the Aedui marched into the country of the Bellovaci and proceeded to devastate their lands. With this injunction he dismissed Diviciacus. Finding that all the Belgic forces had concentrated and were marching against him, and learning from the reconnoitering parties which he had sent out, and from the Remi, that they were not far off, he pushed on rapidly, crossed the Aisne, which flows through the most distant part of the country of the Remi, and encamped near its banks. This movement protected one side of his camp by the banks of the river, secured his rear, and enabled his supplies to be brought up without danger by the Remi and the other tribes. The river was spanned by a bridge, at the head of which he established a strong post, while on the other side of the river he left 6 cohorts under one of his generals, Titurius Sabinus. At the same time he ordered a camp to be constructed, with a rampart 12 feet high and a trench 18 feet wide. 8 miles from the camp there was a town belonging to the Remi called Bibrax. The Belgae attacked it furiously on their march, and the garrison had difficulty in holding out that day. The following method of attacking forts is practiced by Gauls and Belgae alike. Surrounding the whole circuit of the fortifications with a multitude of men, they proceeded to hurl stones from all sides against the wall, and when they have cleared it, they lock their shields over their heads, and advance right up to the gates and undermine the wall. In this case the operation was easily performed, for, with such a huge host hurling stones and other missiles, no man had a chance of keeping his footing on the wall. When night stopped the attack, Iccius, a Reman of the highest rank and very popular with his countrymen, who was acting as governor of the town, one of the envoys who had come to Caesar to sue for peace, sent him word that, unless a force were sent to his relief, he could hold out no longer. About midnight, Caesar, employing as guides the messengers who had come from Iccius, sent his Numidian and Cretan archers and Balearic slingers to Bibrax to relieve the inhabitants. On their arrival, the Remi, inspired by the hope of repelling the attack, became eager to take the offensive, and for the same reason the enemy abandoned the hope of taking the town. Accordingly, after lingering a short time in the neighbourhood, ravaging the lands of the Remi, and burning all of the villages and homesteads within reach, they pushed on with all their forces towards Caesar's camp, and encamped barely 2 miles off. Judging by the smoke and watchfires, their camp extended more than 8 miles in width. Caesar determined, in the first instance, to avoid an action, on account of the great numbers of the enemy, and of their extraordinary reputation for valour. Still, he daily tested in cavalry skirmishes the mettle of the enemy and the daring of our troops, and found that the latter were a match for them. The ground in front of his camp was naturally just suited for forming a line of battle. The hill on which the camp stood, rising gradually from the plain, extended, facing the enemy, over the exact space which the line would occupy. On either flank its sides descended abruptly, while in front it gradually merged in the plain by a gentle slope. On either side of the hill Caesar drew a trench athwart, about 800 paces long, and at the end of each trench erected a redoubt, in which he posted artillery, to prevent the enemy, when he had formed his line, from taking advantage of their great numerical superiority to attack his men in flank and surround them. Having done this, he left his 2 newly raised legions in camp, so that they might be available at any point as a reserve, and drew up the remaining 6 in line of battle in front of the camp. The enemy likewise had marched their forces out of the camp and formed them in line. There was a morass of no great size between our army and that of the enemy. The enemy waited to see whether our men would cross it, while our men, weapons in hand, were ready to attack them in case they crossed first, when their movements would be impeded. Meanwhile, a skirmish of horse was going on between the 2 lines. Neither side would cross first, and the skirmish resulting in favor of our men, Caesar withdrew his infantry into the camp. Forthwith the enemy moved rapidly from their position to gain the river Aisne, which, as the narrative has shown, was in the rear of our camp. There they discovered a ford, and endeavoured to throw a part of their force across, intending, if possible, to storm the redoubt commanded by the general, Quintus Titurius, and break down the bridge, or, failing this, to devastate the lands of the Remi, who were very useful to us in the campaign, and to cut off our troops from supplies. Caesar, on receiving information from Titurius, took the whole of his cavalry, his light-armed Numidians, slingers, and archers, across the bridge, and pushed on rapidly against them. A fierce combat took place at the spot where they were crossing. Our men attacked the enemy in the river, while their movements were impeded, and killed a great number of them. The rest made a most daring attempt to get across over their dead bodies, but they were beaten back by a shower of missiles, while the leading division, who had crossed already, were surrounded by the cavalry and killed. The enemy realized that they had deceived themselves in expecting to storm the stronghold and cross the river. They saw that the Romans would not advance and fight on an unfavourable position, and their supply of grain was beginning to run short. They therefore called a council of war, and decided that the best course would be for the several contingents to return home, and rally from all parts to the defence of the people, whose country the Roman army invaded first. They would thus fight in their own and not in foreign territory, and have the benefit of home-grown supplies. Among other reasons, they were led to adopt this resolution by the knowledge that Diviciacus and the Aedui were approaching the country of the Bellovaci, and the latter could not be induced to remain any longer and refrain from helping their own people. Having come to this decision, they moved out of camp in the second watch with great uproar and confusion. There was no order, no discipline, everybody trying to get the first place on the road, and being in a hurry to reach home, so that their departure resembled a rout. Caesar was promptly informed of what they had done by scouts. Fearing an ambuscade, for he did not yet clearly see the reason for their departure, he kept his army, including the cavalry, in camp. At daybreak the report was confirmed by patrols, and Caesar sent on ahead the whole of his cavalry, commanded by 2 generals, Quintus Pedius and Lucius Aurunculeius Cotta, to retard the rear guard, at the same time ordering Titus Labienus to follow in support with 3 legions. This force attacked the rear guard and pursued them for many miles, killing a large number of the fugitives. For while the rearmost ranks, when overtaken, made a stand, and gallantly resisted the attack of our infantry, the van, fancying themselves out of reach of danger, and not being restrained by necessity or discipline, broke their ranks when they heard the distant cries and ran for their lives. Thus our men slaughtered them in numbers, without any risk to themselves, as long as daylight lasted. Towards sunset they left off, and returned in obedience to instructions to camp. On the following day, before the enemy could recover from their panic flight, Caesar led the army into the country of the Suessiones, who were conterminous with the Remi, and pushed on by a forced march to the stronghold of Noviodunum. Hearing that it was undefended, he attempted, immediately after his arrival, to storm it. But the moat was so broad and the wall so high that, notwithstanding the small number of the garrison, he was unable to carry the position. After entrenching his camp, he proceeded to form a line of sheds and to make the necessary preparations for a siege. On the following night, before he could resume operations, the whole host of the fugitive Suessiones thronged into the town. The sheds were speedily brought up, earth was shot into the moat, and towers were erected, and the Gauls, alarmed by the magnitude of the works, which they had never seen or even heard of before, and also by the swift energy of the Romans, sent envoys to Caesar proposing to surrender. The Remi interceded for their lives, and their prayer was granted. Caesar took the leading men of the tribe, as well as 2 of King Galba's own sons, as hostages, and after all the arms in the town had been delivered up, he accepted the surrender of the Suessiones, and marched into the country of the Bellovaci, who threw themselves with all their belongings into the stronghold of Bratus Pantium. When Caesar and his army were about 5 miles off, the older men all came out, stretched out their hands to him, and declared that they were ready to place themselves under his protection and in his power, and that they were not in arms against the Roman people. In like manner, when he had approached the stronghold and was encamping on its outskirts, the women and children stretched out their hands from the wall in the native fashion and begged the Romans for peace. Diviciacus, who, after the retreat of the Belgae, had disbanded the Aeduan forces and returned to Caesar, interceded for the suppliants. The Bellovaci, he said, had at all times been dependents on the Aedui and in amicable relations with them, but at the instigation of their leaders, who said that the Aedui had been enslaved by Caesar and had to put up with ill usage and insults of every kind, they had abandoned their connection with them and taken up arms against the Roman people. The ringleaders, realizing the magnitude of the disaster which they had brought upon their country, had escaped to Britain. Not only the Bellovaci, but also the Aedui on their behalf, would beg Caesar to treat them with the forbearance and humanity for which he was distinguished. By doing so he would increase the authority of the Aedui among the Belgae generally, for the Aedui commonly relied on their assistance and resources to carry on any wars in which they happened to be engaged. Caesar said he would spare their lives and take them under his protection out of respect for Diviciacus and the Aedui. But as the tribe ranked high among the Belgae and had a very large population, he required 600 hostages. After they had delivered over and all the arms brought out of the town and piled, Caesar marched from Bratus Pantium to the territory of the Ambiani, who surrendered unreservedly without delay. Their territory was conterminous with that of the Nervii. Caesar made inquiries about the character, manners, and customs of this people, and collected the following information. Traders were not allowed to enter their country. They would not permit the importation of anything in the shape of wine or other luxuries, believing that courage was enfeebled by these indulgences, and manly vigor enervated. They were a fierce, brave people, and railing at the other Belgae and accusing them of having surrendered to the Romans and made shipwreck of their ancestral valor, they vowed that they would not send envoys or accept peace on any terms. End of Book 2, chapters 1 through 15. Book 2, chapters 16 through 35 of Commentaries on the Gallic War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar, translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book 2, chapters 16 through 35. After marching for 3 days through their territory, Caesar learned from prisoners that the Nervii had encamped on the further side of the river called the Sambre, which was not more than 10 miles from his camp, and were there awaiting the arrival of the Romans, along with their neighbours the Atrebates and the Viromandui, both of whom they had persuaded to share with them the fortune of war. They were waiting for the force of the Aduatuci, which was marching to join them, and they had hastily transferred their women, and all who were disqualified by age for fighting to a spot which was rendered inaccessible for an army by marshes. On learning this, Caesar sent on ahead a reconnoitring party and centurions to choose a good position for a camp. A considerable number of the Belgae who had surrendered and other Gauls had followed him and were marching in his train. Some of them, as was afterwards ascertained from prisoners, having observed the order in which our army marched during the first 3 days, made their way to the Nervii in the night, and explained to them that each legion was followed by a great quantity of baggage, and that when the foremost legion reached camp and the rest were a long way off, there would be no difficulty in attacking it while the men were burdened with their packs. When it was beaten and its baggage plundered, the rest would not venture to make a stand. One circumstance favoured the plan recommended by the men who gave this information. In times past, the Nervii, having no cavalry, to this day they pay no attention to that arm, their whole strength being in infantry, devised the following method of checking their neighbours' cavalry when they made plundering raids into their territory. Lopping off the tops of young saplings and bending them over so that their branches shot out thickly sideways, they planted brambles and briars between, the hedges thus formed making a barrier like a wall, which made it impossible not only to penetrate but even to see through. As the march of our column was delayed by these obstacles, the Nervii felt that the proffered advice was worth following. The lie of the ground which our men had selected for their camp may be thus described. A hill sloped evenly down from its summit to the river Sambre already mentioned. From the river there arose a second hill of the same gradient, opposite the other, and directly facing it. The ground was open at the lower end for about 400 paces, but wooded higher up, so that it was not easy to see through. The enemy were in ambush within the woods, while on the open ground along the river a few cavalry piquets were visible. The depth of the river was about 3 feet high. Caesar had sent on his cavalry in advance, and was following with all his forces, but the column was formed on a different principle, from which the Belgae had described to the Nervii. 6 of Caesar's legions, according to his usual practice when he was approaching an enemy, were advancing in light marching order. Behind them was the baggage train of the entire army, followed by the 2 newly raised legions, which closed the rear and protected the baggage. Our cavalry, along with the slingers and archers, crossed the river and engaged the enemy's horse. The latter fell back repeatedly into the woods on support of their comrades, and again emerging, charged our men, who dared not pursue them, when they retreated beyond the fringe of the open ground. Meanwhile, the 6 legions which had come up first proceeded to entrench the camp along the lines which had been marked out. When the head of our baggage train was descried by the troops ambushed in the woods, the moment which they had agreed upon for the beginning of the battle, suddenly, in the exact order in which, with mutual exhortations, they formed their line within, the whole force darted forth and swooped down upon our cavalry. Sending them flying in disorder, without any effort, they rushed down to the stream with such incredible swiftness that it seemed as if almost at the same instant they were at the woods, in the river, and now at sword's point with our men. As swiftly they pressed up the hill to attack our camp, and the men who were engaged in entrenching it. Caesar had to arrange everything at once, display the red flag, the signal for arming, sound the trumpet, recall the men from the trenches, send for those who had gone further afield in search of wood, form the line, harangue the troops, and give the signal for battle. Want of time and the enemy's onset prevented much of this from being done. 2 things, however, served to lighten his difficulties. First, the knowledge and experience of the soldiers, who, as seasoned campaigners, were able to decide for themselves what ought to be done as well as others could tell them. And secondly, the fact that he had forbidden his marshals to leave the works and their respective legions till the camp was entrenched. As the enemy were so close and coming up so fast, they did not wait for orders from Caesar, but made the arrangements which they thought right on their own responsibility. Caesar, after giving indispensable orders, hurried down at haphazard to encourage the soldiers, and came to the 10th Legion. He spoke briefly, merely urging the men to remember their ancient valor, keep cool, and sustain resolutely the enemy's rush. Then, as the enemy were within range, he gave the signal for action. Going on to another part of the field to encourage the men, he found them already engaged. Time was so short, and the enemy were so ready and eager for battle, that there were not a moment even for putting on helmets and pulling up the covers off shields, much less for fitting on crests. Each man, as he came down from the trenches, fell in by the standard he first caught sight of, wherever he happened to find himself, not wishing to waste the time for action in looking for the men of his company. The army was drawn up as well as time permitted, according to the requirements of the ground, and the slope of the hill, rather than the formation prescribed by tactical rules. The legions were separated and making head against the enemy at different points, while the view was interrupted, as we have explained before, by hedges of extraordinary thickness. It was therefore impossible to post reserves at fixed points, or to foresee what would be wanted at each and every part of the field. Nor could one man give all the necessary orders. With such adverse conditions, then, the vicissitudes of fortune were naturally various. The men of the 9th and 10th legions were posted on the left of the line. With a volley of javelins they drove the Atrebates, the division which they had encountered, who were breathless and tired from their rapid charge and enfeebled by wounds, from the high ground to the river, and when they attempted to cross, pressed them, sword in hand, and killed a great many while their movements were impeded. Crossing themselves without hesitation, and pushing on though the slope was against them, when the enemy rallied they renewed the combat, and routed them. Similarly, in another part of the field, 2 legions, the 11th and 8th, which were separated from one another, encountered the Virumandui, drove them from the higher ground, and maintained the combat right on the banks of the river. Nearly the whole camp, however, in front and on the left was exposed, and the 12th legion, and at no great distance the 7th, being posted on the right wing, the whole of the Nervii formed in compact column, and led by Boduonatus, the commander-in-chief, advanced rapidly against the position, and while some of them began to move round the legions on their exposed flank, others made for the summit of the hill on which the camp stood. At the same time our cavalry, and the light armed foot associated with them, who were routed, as I have said, by the enemy's first charge, were retreating to the camp when they came full upon the enemy, and again took to flight in another direction. And the servants, who from the rear gate, situated on the crest of the ridge, had seen our victorious troops cross the river, and had gone out to plunder, looked back, and, seeing the enemy moving about in the camp, precipitately fled. Simultaneously a babel of voices arose from the men who were coming up with the baggage, and they rushed panic-stricken in different directions. A body of horsemen belonging to the Treveri, whose courage is proverbial among the Gauls, had been sent by their tribe as an auxiliary force to join Caesar. Alarmed by all these signs of panic, seeing that our camp was thronged by the enemy, and that the legions were hard-pressed and all but hemmed in, that servants, horsemen, slingers, and Numidians had parted company and scattered, and were flying in all directions, they despaired of our success, hastened homewards, and told their countrymen that the Romans were disastrously defeated, and that the enemy had captured their camp and baggage. Caesar, after haranguing the 10th legion, had gone off to the right wing. He saw that his troops were hard pressed, and that the men of the 12th legion, their standards closely massed, were crowded together and preventing each other from fighting. All the centurions of the 4th cohort, as well as the standard-bearer, were killed. The standard was lost. Almost all the centurions of the other cohorts were either killed or wounded, including the chief centurion, Publius Sextius Baculus, the bravest of the brave, who was so exhausted by a number of severe wounds that he could no longer keep his feet. The men had lost all dash, and some in the rear ranks had abandoned their posts, and were slinking away from the field and getting out of range, while the enemy were coming up in front in an unbroken stream from below, and closed in on both flanks. In short, the situation was critical, and there was no reserve available. Seeing all this, Caesar, who had come up without a shield, took one from a soldier in the rear rank, stepped forward into the front rank, and, addressing the centurions by name, encouraged the men and told them to advance, opening their ranks so that they might be able to use their swords more readily. His coming inspired them with hope and gave them new heart, and as every one, even in his extremest peril, was anxious to do his utmost under the eyes of his general, the enemy's onset was in some measure checked. Noticing that the 7th legion, which stood close by, was likewise hard pressed by the enemy, Caesar told the tribunes to make the legions gradually approach one another, face the enemy on all sides, and advance. This was done, and, as the men now gave each other mutual support, and were not afraid of being taken in rear, they began to offer a more confident resistance, and to fight with more resolution. Meanwhile, the men of the 2 legions which had brought up the rear and guarded the baggage, having received news of the action, had quickened their pace, and were descried on the brow of the hill by the enemy, and Titus Labienus, who had captured the enemy's camp, and observed from the high ground what was going on in ours, sent the 10th legion to the assistance of our men. Realizing from the flight of the cavalry and servants how matters stood, and seeing that camp, legions, and general were in great peril, they put forth their utmost speed. Their arrival wrought such a complete change that, on our side, even men who had lain down severely wounded leaned on their shields and renewed their fight. The servants, noticing the enemy's alarm, rushed upon them, unarmed against armed, while the cavalry, anxious to wipe out the disgrace of their flight by gallant deeds, outvied the legionaries at every point. But the enemy, even in their despair, displayed such heroic courage that, when their foremost ranks had fallen, the next mounted upon their prostrate comrades, and fought standing on their bodies, and when they too were struck down, and the corpses littered in a heap, the survivors hurled, as from a mound, their missiles against our men, and picked up and flung back their javelins. We are not to think, then, that it was in vain that these gallant men dared to cross a broad river, to climb high banks, and to assail a formidable position. These things, in themselves most difficult, had been made easy by their heroism. The battle was over, and the Nervian people, nay, their very name, was brought to the verge of extinction. On hearing the news, the old people, who, as we have said, had taken refuge, along with the women and children, in tidal creeks and swamps, believing that there was nothing to stop the victors, and no security for the vanquished, sent envoys to Caesar with the consent of all the survivors, and surrendered. And, recounting the calamity which had befallen their country, they affirmed that their council had been reduced from 600 to 3, and the number of men capable of bearing arms from 60,000 to a bare 500. Caesar, wishing to establish his character for mercy towards unfortunate suppliants, was careful to shield them from harm, authorized them to retain possession of their territories and strongholds, and commanded their neighbors to abstain and to make their dependents abstain from maltreating or molesting them. The Aduatuci, whose movements we have already described, were coming with all their forces to the assistance of the Nervii, when, on the announcement of the battle, they turned without halting and went home. Abandoning their other strongholds and fortified posts, they removed all their belongings into one fortress of extraordinary natural strength. All round it presented a line of high rocks and steep declivities, which at one point left a gently sloping approach, not more than 200 feet wide. This place the garrison had fortified with a double wall of great height, upon which, as a further protection, they were laying stones of great weight and sharp-pointed beams. The Aduatuci were descended from the Cimbri and Teutoni, who, on their march for our province and Italy, left the stock and baggage which they were unable to drive or carry with them on this side of the Rhine, with some of their number to look after them, and 6,000 men to protect them. After the fate of their countrymen, this band was for many years harassed by the neighboring peoples, sometimes attacking, at other times repelling attack. At length they made peace, and with the consent of all the other tribes, selected this district as their abode. Immediately after the arrival of our army, the Aduatuci made a series of sorties from the town, and engaged in skirmishes with our troops. Afterwards, however, finding themselves shut in by a rampart 12 feet high and 3 miles in extent, with numerous redoubts, they kept inside the stronghold. A line of sheds was formed, and a terrace constructed, and seeing a tower in the process of erection some way off, they at first jeered and made abusive remarks from the wall at the idea of such a huge machine being erected at such a distance. Did these pygmy Romans, with their feeble hands and puny muscles — the Gauls, as a rule, despise our short stature, contrasting it with their own great height — believe themselves able to mount such a ponderous tower on the wall? When, however, they saw it in motion and actually approaching the walls, the strange and unwonted spectacle alarmed them, and they sent envoys to Caesar to sue for peace. The envoys, saying that Roman warriors were evidently not left unaided by the gods, since they could propel such towering engines at such a rate, declared themselves ready to surrender unreservedly. One thing only they would beg him not to do, if haply in his mercy and forbearance, of which they heard from other peoples, he decided to spare the Aduatuci, not to deprive them of their arms. Almost all their neighbours were their bitter enemies, and jealous of their prowess, and if they surrendered their arms, they could not defend themselves against them. If they were reduced to the alternative, it would be better for them to suffer any fate at the hands of the Romans, rather than be tortured to death by men among whom they were accustomed to hold sway. To this appeal Caesar replied that he would spare the tribe, not because they deserved mercy, but because it was his wont to be merciful, provided they surrendered before the ram touched the wall. But the question of surrender could not be entertained unless they gave up their arms. He would act as he had acted in the case of the Nervii, and order their neighbours not to molest those who had surrendered to the Roman people. The envoys, after reporting his decision to their principals, professed themselves ready to obey his commands. A great quantity of arms was pitched down from the wall into the trench in front of the town, the heap almost reaching to the top of the wall and of the terrace. And yet, as was afterwards discovered, about 1/3 was concealed and kept in the town. The gates were then thrown open, and on the same day the garrison entered upon the enjoyment of peace. Towards evening Caesar ordered the gates to be shut and the soldiers to leave the town, for fear the inhabitants should suffer any injury at their hands in the night. They had evidently prearranged a plan, believing that, after the capitulation, our troops would withdraw their piquets, or at any rate be less vigilant in maintaining them, and taking the arms which they had kept back and concealed, as well as shields made of bark or wattle-work, which, being pressed for a time, they had hastily covered with skins, they made a sudden sortie in the third watch, with their whole force at the point where the slope leading up to our entrenchments appeared easiest. The alarm was promptly given, in obedience to orders which Caesar had issued in anticipation, by fire signals, and troops hurried to the point from the nearest redoubts. The enemy's whole hope of safety depended on courage alone, and they fought with the fierce energy which was to be expected from brave men, fighting on a forlorn hope, on unfavourable ground, against opponents who were hurling their missiles from rampart and towers. About 4,000 were killed, and the rest driven back into the town. The next day, as there was no longer any resistance, the gates were burst open, the soldiers were sent in, and Caesar sold by auction, in one lot, all of the booty of war found in the town. The purchasers reported the number of individuals as 53,000. At the same time, Caesar was informed by Publius Crassus, whom he had sent with a single legion to the territories of the Venetii, Venelii, Busismi, Coriosolites, Esuvii, Aulerci, and Rhedones, maritime tribes whose country reaches the ocean, that all of them had been brought completely under the dominion of the Roman people. These operations resulted in the pacification of the whole Gaul, and the natives were so impressed by the story of the campaign which reached them, that the peoples who dwelt beyond the Rhine sent envoys to Caesar, promising to give hostages and fulfill his commands. Being anxious to get to Italy and Illyricum without delay, he ordered the envoys to return to him at the commencement of the following summer. Quartering his legions for the winter in the territories of the Carnutes, Andes, Torone, and other tribes which were near the theatre of the recent campaign, he started for Italy. On the receipt of his dispatches, a thanksgiving service of 15 days was appointed to celebrate his achievements, an honour which had not hitherto fallen to the lot of any one. End of Book 2, chapters 16 through 35.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. To learn more or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar, translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book 3, chapters 1 through 16. Galba's campaign in the Valais, campaigns against the maritime tribes, and the Aquitani. When Caesar was starting for Italy, he sent Servius Galba, with the 12th legion, and a detachment of cavalry to the country belonging to the Nantuates, Veragri, and Sidoni, which extends from the frontier of the Allobroges, the Lake of Geneva, and the Rhone to the crest of the Alps, being anxious to open up the route over the Alps, by which traders usually travelled at great risk and with the obligation of paying heavy tolls. Galba was authorized to quarter his legion in the district for the winter if he thought it necessary. After he had gained several victories and taken a number of forts belonging to the tribesmen, they sent envoys to him from all parts, gave hostages, and made peace, whereupon he determined to quarter 2 cohorts in the country of the Nantuates, and to winter with the remaining cohorts of the legion in a village belonging to the Veragri, called Octodurus. The village, which is situated in a valley and adjoined by a plain of moderate extent, is walled in on every side by lofty mountains. It was divided by a stream into 2 parts, one of which he allowed the Gauls to occupy, while he reserved the vacant part for the winter quarters of the cohorts, and fortified the position with a rampart and trench. Several days had been spent in camp, and Galba had ordered grain to be brought in, when suddenly he was informed by his patrols that during the night the Gauls had all quitted the part of the village which he had allotted to them, and that the overhanging mountains were occupied by a numerous host of Sidoni and Veragri. Various reasons had led the Gauls to form the sudden resolution of renewing hostilities and overpowering the legion. First, the legion was numerically so weak that they despised it. It had not been at its full strength originally, and 2 cohorts, as well as numerous individuals who had been sent out to get supplies, had been withdrawn. Again, as the Romans had the worst of the ground, while they would themselves hurl their missiles charging down into the valley from the hills, they were confident that their first onslaught would be irresistible. Besides, they resented their children being taken from them as hostages, and they were convinced that the Romans were trying to occupy the commanding points of the Alps, and to annex the district to the neighbouring province, not merely in order to open up communication, but to secure a permanent possession. The work of entrenching the camp was not yet quite completed, and corn and other supplies had not been provided in sufficient quantity, for Galba had concluded that, as the enemy had submitted, and he had received their hostages, there was no reason to fear hostilities. Accordingly, on receiving the news, he promptly called a council of war and invited opinions. Great peril had befallen suddenly and unexpectedly. Already, indeed, almost all the heights were seen to be swarming with armed men. The roads were blocked, and therefore it was impossible for relief to arrive or for supplies to be brought up, and safety was deemed all but hopeless. Some, therefore, expressed the opinion that they ought to abandon the baggage, make a sortie, and try to reach a place of safety by the same route by which they had come. The majority, however, decided to reserve this plan to the last, and meanwhile to defend the camp and await developments. After a short interval, which barely gave time for making the dispositions and carrying out the arrangement which had been resolved upon, the enemy rushed down at a given signal from every side, and hurled stones and javelins on to the rampart. At first, while our men were still fresh, they resisted stoutly, not a missile which they threw from their commanding position missing its mark, and when any part of the camp that was inadequately manned appeared to be hard pressed, men hurried to the rescue. But what told against them was that when the enemy were exhausted by prolonged fighting, they went out of action and fresh men took their places, while our men, owing to their slender numbers, could not follow their example. And not only was it impossible for a man to go out of action when he was tired, but even if wounded he could not leave his post and recover himself. For more than 6 hours the fighting had been incessant. Not only the strength of our men, but even their missiles were failing. The enemy were pressing on with increased energy, and as our men grew feebler, they began to fill up the trenches and demolish the rampart. In this extremity Publius Sextius Baculus, the chief centurion who, as we have said, had received several severe wounds in the battle with the Nervi, ran to Galba, accompanied by Gaius Velicinus, a tribune of great judgment and courage, and pointed out that the only chance of safety was to try a forlorn hope and make a sortie. Galba therefore summoned the Centurions, and quickly made the men understand that they were to leave off fighting for a little, only parrying the enemy's missiles, rest after their exertions, and afterwards, when the signal was given, charge out of the camp and trust for safety to sheer courage. The order was carried out. Suddenly they charged out of all the gates, and never gave the enemy a chance of divining their intention or closing the ranks. Fortune had changed sides. The assailants, who had actually hoped to take the camp, were surrounded and slain. More than a third of the entire native force that had assailed the camp, which was known to number over 30,000 men, were killed. The rest were sent flying in panic, and the Romans would not suffer them to rally even on the heights. Having thus routed the entire hostile force and taken their arms, they returned to their entrenchments. After fighting this battle, Galba had no wish to tempt fortune any more. He reflected that the circumstances with which he had to contend were at variance with the purpose for which he had taken up his quarters, and the scarcity of corn and other supplies caused him great anxiety. Next day, therefore, he fired all the buildings in the village and hastened to return to the province. And, as no enemy attempted to stop him or oppose his march, he brought the legion back safely into the country of the Nantuates, and thence to that of the Allobroges, where he passed the winter. After these operations everything led Caesar to believe that Gaul was tranquillized, for the Belgae were overpowered, the Germans driven out, and the Siduni defeated in the Alps. Accordingly, he had started at the beginning of winter for Illyricum, being anxious to visit the tribes there as well as those of Gaul, and to make himself acquainted with their country, when suddenly war broke out in Gaul for the following reason. The younger Publius Crassus, who was wintering with the 7th legion among the Andes near the ocean, finding that corn was scarce in the district, sent a number of auxiliary officers and tribunes to the neighbouring tribes to arrange for a supply. Amongst others, Titus Tarasidius was sent to the Suevi, Marcus Trebius Gallus to the Coriasolites, and Quintus Valenius, conjointly with Titus Celius, to the Veneti. The last named tribe is by far the most influential of all the maritime peoples in that part of the country. They possess numerous ships in which they regularly sail to Britain. They excel the other peoples in knowledge of navigation and seamanship, and, the sea being very stormy and open, with only a few scattered harbours which they keep under their control, they compel almost all who sail those waters to pay toll. They took the initiative by detaining Celius and Valenius, believing that they would be able to use them to get back the hostages whom they had given to Crassus. Their neighbours, influenced by their example, and making up their minds like true Gauls suddenly and without consideration, detained Trebius and Tarasidius for the same reason, hurriedly dispatched envoys, and through the medium of their leaders pledged themselves to do nothing without official sanction, and to stand by one another in victory or defeat, and called upon the other tribes to resolve to hold fast to the liberty which they had received from their forefathers, and not to submit to the yoke of the Romans. They speedily gained over all the maritime tribes, and jointly sent an embassy to Publius Crassus, calling upon him, if he wished, to recover his officers, to restore their hostages. When Caesar was informed of these events by Crassus, he was a long way off, and accordingly gave orders that ships of war should be built before his return on the Loire, which flows into the ocean. Oarsmen raised from the province, and seamen and pilots assembled. These orders were promptly executed, and as soon as the season permitted he hastened to join the army. On hearing of his approach, the Veneti, and also the other tribes, being aware that they had committed a heinous offence in detaining and imprisoning envoys, whose office had always, among all peoples, been held sacred and inviolable, proceeded to make preparations for war, and especially to provide for the equipment of their ships, on a scale commensurate with the magnitude of the danger. And they worked with a hopefulness which was increased by their faith in the natural strength of their country. They knew that the roads were interrupted by estuaries, and that navigation was rendered difficult by the want of topographical information and the scarcity of harbours. They were confident that our armies would not be able to remain long in their country, for want of grain, and even if all their calculations were upset, they had command of the sea, while the Romans were ill supplied with ships and had no knowledge of the theatre of the approaching war, the shoals, harbours, and islands. Finally, they saw that navigation in a landlocked sea and in the open, boundless ocean were very different things. After forming their plans, they fortified their strongholds, stored them with grain from the country districts, and assembled as many ships as possible in Venetia, where it was known that Caesar would open the campaign. They secured the alliance of the Osimi, Lexovi, Nimnetes, Ambiliatae, Morini, Diablintes, and Menapii, and sent for reinforcements to Britain, which faces that part of Gaul. The difficulties above mentioned which beset the campaign were serious, but nevertheless Caesar had many urgent motives for undertaking it. The violation of international law in detaining Roman knights, the fact that the tribes after submission had renewed hostilities and revolted although they had given hostages, the wide extension of the conspiracy, and, above all, the danger that, if this district were left unpunished, the other peoples would fancy that they might offend in the same way. Knowing therefore that the Gauls were almost all politically restless, and that their warlike passions were easily and swiftly roused, and moreover that all men are naturally fond of freedom and hate to be in subjection, he thought it best before more tribes had time to join the movement to break up his army and distribute it over a wider area. Accordingly, he sent Titus Labienus with a body of cavalry into the country of the Treveri, near the Rhine, with orders to visit Remi and the other Belgic peoples and keep them obedient. And in case the Germans, whose assistance was said to have been solicited by the Belgae, attempted to force a passage in boats across the river, to stop them. Publius Crassus was directed to march with 12 legionary cohorts and a strong body of cavalry for Aquitania, in order to prevent the dispatch of reinforcements to Gaul from the peoples of that country and the junction of two powerful races. Quintus Titurius Sabinus, one of the generals, was sent with 3 legions into the country of the Venelli, Coriosolites, and Lexovi, to keep that section of the rebels isolated. The younger Decimus Brutus was placed in command of the fleet and of the Gallic ships which Caesar had ordered to assemble from the ports of the Pictones and Centoni and from the other settled districts, with orders to sail, as soon as possible, for the country of the Veneti. Caesar marched thither in person with the land forces. The strongholds were generally so situated on the ends of spits or headlands that it was impossible to approach them on foot when the tide came rushing in from the open sea, which regularly happens every 12 hours, or to sail up to them, because at the ebb the ships would have been injured in the shallow water. Both of these causes interfered with the siege of the strongholds. The besiegers kept out the sea by building dikes, and by this means got on a level with the walls of the town. But when the besieged, overmatched by the magnitude of the works, began to lose confidence, they brought up a large number of ships, of which they had an unlimited supply, removed all their property, and withdrew to the nearest strongholds, where they again defended themselves by the same advantages of position. These tactics they found it easy to keep up during a great part of the summer, because our ships were detained by stormy weather, and navigation was very difficult in a vast open sea, where the tides were strong and harbours few and far between. Indeed, practically non-existent. Their own ships were built and fitted out in the following way. They were a good deal more flat-bottomed than ours, to adapt them to the conditions of shallow water and ebbing tides. Bows and sterns alike were very lofty, being thus enabled to resist heavy seas and severe gales. The hulls were built throughout of oak, in order to stand any amount of violence and rough usage. The cross timbers, consisting of beams a foot thick, were riveted with iron bolts as thick as a man's thumb. The anchors were secured with iron chains instead of ropes. Hides or leathers dressed fine were used instead of sails, either because flax was scarce and the natives did not know how to manufacture it, or, more probably, because they thought it difficult to make head against the violent storms and squalls of the ocean, and to manage vessels of such burthen with ordinary sails. When these ships encountered our fleet, the latter had the advantage only in speed and in being propelled by oars. In other respects the former, from their more suitable construction, were better adapted to the conditions of the coast and the force of the storms. They were so solidly built that our ships could not injure them by ramming. Owing to their height, it was not easy to throw javelins onto them, and for the same reason it was difficult to seize them with grappling irons. Moreover, when it began to blow hard and they were running before the wind, they could weather the storm more easily, they could lie up more safely in shallow water, and when they were left aground by the ebb, they had nothing to fear from a stony bottom and sharp rocks, whereas our ships were in great danger from all of these contingencies. After taking several strongholds, Caesar saw that all his labour was being expended in vain, and that, by merely capturing their forts, he could neither prevent the enemy from escaping nor cripple them. He decided, therefore, that it would be best to wait for his fleet. As soon as it arrived and was sighted by the enemy, their ships, numbering about 220 ready for sea and fully equipped, stood out of harbour and ranged opposite ours. Brutus, who commanded the fleet, and the tribunes and centurions, each of whom had been entrusted with a single ship, did not quite know what to do, or what tactics to adopt. They had ascertained that it was impossible to injure the enemy's ships by ramming. The turrets were run up, but even then they were overtopped by the foreigners' lofty sterns, so that, from the lower position, it was impossible to throw javelins with effect, while the missiles thrown by the Gauls fell with increased momentum. Our men, however, had a very effective contrivance ready, namely hooks, sharpened at the end and fixed to long poles shaped somewhat like grappling hooks. By means of these the halyards were seized and pulled taut. The galley rode hard, and the ropes snapped. When they were cut, the yards of course fell down, and as the efficiency of the Gallic ships depended altogether upon their sails and rigging, when they were gone the ships were no longer of any use. Thenceforward the struggle turned upon sheer courage, in which our soldiers easily had the advantage, especially as the fighting went on under the eyes of Caesar and the whole army, so that no act of courage at all remarkable could escape notice, for all the cliffs and high ground which commanded a near view over the sea were occupied by the army. When, as we have said, the yards tumbled down, the Roman ships 2 or 3 at a time closed round one of the enemies, and the legionaries clambered aboard with the utmost vigour. Several ships had been captured, when the natives, seeing what was happening and realizing that there was no help for it, hastened to save themselves by flight. And now, just as the ships had been put before the wind, there was suddenly a dead calm, and they could not stir. This was just what was wanted to make the victory complete. Our men gave chase and captured the ships one after another, with the result that, after a battle lasting from about the 4th hour till sunset, only a very few of the whole armada managed, when the night stopped the pursuit, to make the land. This battle brought the war with the Veneti and all the coast tribes to an end, for all the fighting men, and indeed all the seniors of any standing or whose counsels had any weight, had taken part in it. They had brought every one of their ships into action, and now that they were lost, the survivors had no place to escape to and no means of defending their strongholds. They surrendered, therefore, to Caesar unreservedly. He determined to inflict upon them a signal punishment, in order to make the natives respect the rights of ambassadors more carefully in the future. Accordingly, he put to death the entire council, and sold the rest of the population into slavery. End of chapters 1 through 16. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Becky Cook. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar. Translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book 3, Chapters 17 through 29. While these events were passing in the country of the Veneti, Quintus Titurius Sabinus made his way with the troops assigned to him by Caesar into the country of the Venelli. Their leader was Viridovix, who was also commander-in-chief of all the insurgent tribes, and had raised from them an army and large irregular levies. Within the few days that followed Sabinus's arrival, the Aulerci Eborovices and the Lexovii massacred their senators because they refused to sanction the war, shut their gates, and joined Viridovix. And a host of desperadoes and brigands had also assembled from all parts of Gaul, to whom the hope of plunder and love of fighting were more attractive than farming and regular work. Sabinus, who occupied a position in all respects excellent, remained obstinately in camp, while Viridovix, who had encamped opposite him 2 miles off, led out his troops every day and offered battle. The result was that Sabinus not only incurred the contempt of the enemy, but was actually the object of some abuse from his own troops, and he let the enemy become so convinced of his timidity that they presently ventured to approach close to the rampart. His motive was that he felt bound, as a subordinate, especially in the absence of his chief, to avoid engaging such a numerous enemy unless he had the best of ground or some favourable opportunity presented itself. Now that they were convinced of his timidity, he selected from his auxiliaries a quick-witted Gaul, the very man for his purpose, induced him by liberal rewards and promises to go over to the enemy, and explained his object. The man came to them in the guise of a deserter, described the terror of the Romans, and explained that Caesar himself was hard pressed by the Veneti, and that Sabinus would march his army stealthily out of camp not later than the following night and go to his assistance. On hearing this, they all cried out that the chance of striking a decisive blow was not to be lost. They must attack the camp. Many circumstances combined to impel them to this decision. The recent inaction of Sabinus, the assurances of the deserter, want of supplies, for which they had made scant provision, the hope that the Veneti would succeed in their campaign, and lastly, the fact that what men desire they are generally prone to believe. Influenced by these motives, they would not suffer Viridovix and the other leaders to leave the assembly until they had agreed to let them arm and make a dash for the camp. When they were allowed to have their way, they were as exultant as if victory were certain, and, collecting brushwood and faggots to fill up the Roman trenches, they advanced against the camp. The camp stood on rising ground, which sloped gently from its base for about a mile. The Gauls hurried up at a great pace in order to give the Romans the least possible time for falling into line and arming, and arrived breathless. Sabinus harangued his men, and gave the signal which they were eagerly awaiting. As the enemy were hampered by their loads, he ordered a sudden sortie from 2 of the gates. Thanks to the favourable position, the courage of the legionaries, and the experience which they had gained in previous combats, and their own want of skill and exhaustion, the enemy instantly turned tail without standing a single charge from our men. They were in no condition to escape, and our troops, who were fresh for our pursuit, killed a great number of them. The rest were hunted down by the cavalry, who allowed few to get away. Thus Sabinus heard of the sea fight and Caesar of Sabinus's victory at the same time, and all the tribes immediately submitted to Titurius. For, while the Gallic temperament is impetuous and warlike, their character is irresolute and has little power of bearing up against a disaster. About the same time Crassus arrived in Aquitania, which, as the narrative has shown, may be regarded in Aryan population as 1/3 of Gaul. Knowing that he had to fight in a country where, a few years before, a Roman general, Lucius Valerius Praeconinus, had been killed and his army defeated, and from which a proconsul, Lucius Manlius, had retreated in disorder with the loss of his baggage, he saw that he would have to exercise no ordinary care. Accordingly, he provided for a supply of grain, raised auxiliaries and cavalry, and also called out individually a large number of excellent soldiers from Tolosa, Carcasso, and Narbo, states in the province adjacent to Aquitania, and marched his army into the country of the Sociates. On becoming aware of his approach, raised a large force, including cavalry, being very strong in that arm, and attacked our column on its march. The battle began with a combat of horse. Their cavalry were repulsed, and ours were pursuing them, when suddenly they unmasked their infantry, which they had stationed in ambush in a valley. The latter fell upon our disordered troops and renewed the action. The fighting was prolonged and fierce, for the Sociates relied upon their past victories, and felt that the fate of all Aquitania depended upon their courage, while our men were eager that the world should see what they could achieve under their youthful leader, without the chief and the other legions. At length the enemy, having suffered heavy loss, turned and fled. Many of them were slain, and Crassus, advancing to the chief town of the Sociates, at once proceeded to lay siege to it. As the garrison offered a stout resistance, he brought up sheds and towers. The garrison first attempted a sortie, then drove galleries in the direction of the terrace and sheds. The Aquitanians are very skilled in operations of this kind, as mining work exists in many parts of their country. But finding that, owing to the vigilance of our troops, they could effect nothing by these devices, they sent envoys to Crassus, asking him to accept their surrender. The request was granted, and, in obedience to his command, they laid down their arms. But all was not over. Our men were all intently watching what was going on, when Audiobook, who was in command, attempted a sortie from another part of the town with 600 devoted followers, whom the natives called Soldurii, men who, while life lasts, share all good things with the friends to whom they have attached themselves, on the understanding that, if any violence befall them, they are either to share their fate or to die by their own hands. And within the memory of man no one has ever been known to shrink from death when his friend and leader was slain. With these men Audiobook attempted a sortie, but when the roar of battle arose from that part of the entrenchment, the soldiers ran to arms, and, after hard fighting, Audiobook was driven back into the town. Notwithstanding, he prevailed upon Crassus to allow him to surrender on the original terms. On receiving the arms and hostages, Crassus started for the country of the Vocates and the Taurosates. And now, learning that a fortified town of great natural strength had been captured a few days after the arrival of the besiegers, the natives were thoroughly alarmed and began to send envoys in all directions, to swear mutual fidelity, to exchange hostages, and to raise troops. Envoys were also sent to the tribes of Hither Spain, near Aquitania, with a request for reinforcements and leaders, whose arrival enabled them to undertake the campaign with great prestige and to put a large number of men in the field. The leaders chosen had served from first to last with Quintus Sertorius, and were believed to possess great military skill. Adopting Roman methods, they proceeded to select positions, to entrench their camp, and to cut off our convoys." Crassus, reflecting that his own force was too small to be readily divided, that the enemy, while scouring the country and blocking the roads, were able to leave a sufficient force to protect their camp, which made it difficult to bring up corn and other supplies, and that their numbers were daily increasing, thought it best to fight a decisive battle without delay. He referred the question to a council of war, and, finding that everyone agreed with him, determined to fight on the morrow. At daybreak he moved out the whole force, formed them into 2 lines with auxiliaries in the centre, and awaited the development of the enemy's plans. Although relying on their numbers, their established military reputation, and the weakness of our force, they considered it safe to fight. They nevertheless thought it safer to gain a bloodless victory by blocking the roads and cutting off our supplies, while, in case the Romans began to retreat from want of food, their idea was to attack them on the march, when their movements were impeded and they had the packs to carry and were dispirited. The plan was approved by their leaders, and accordingly when the Roman army moved out they remained shut up in camp. Crassus divined their intention. Their inaction, which produced the belief that they were cowed, had stimulated the ardor of our troops for battle, and all were overheard saying that the camp ought to be attacked without further delay. So Crassus, haranguing his men, who were all in great heart, advanced rapidly against the enemy's camp. Some filled up the trenches, others drove the defenders from the rampart and fortification with volleys of missiles, and the auxiliaries, in whose soldierly qualities Crassus had not much faith, kept the combatants supplied with stones and other missiles, brought up sods for filling the trench, and thus made a decent show of fighting. The enemy, too, fought steadily and with no lack of courage, and the missiles which they threw from their commanding position did good execution. Meanwhile, some troopers rode round the enemy's camp and reported to Crassus that on the side of the rear gate it was not entrenched so carefully as elsewhere and offered easy entrance. Crassus urged his cavalry officers to stimulate their men by liberal rewards and promises, and explained his object. In obedience to orders, they marched out the cohorts which had been left to protect the camp and had had nothing to tire them, made a wide detour to avoid being observed from the enemy's camp, and, while everybody was intent upon the action and noticed nothing else, rapidly gained the part of the entrenchments which we have mentioned, demolished them, and made good their footing in the camp before the enemy could clearly see them or make out what was going on. And now, when our troops heard the shouting from that part of the camp, their strength returned, as generally happens when soldiers feel confident of victory, and they fought with redoubled energy. Finding themselves surrounded, the enemy in utter despair hastened to throw themselves over the entrenchments and ran for their lives. The cavalry hunted them over the broad, open plains. Out of 50,000 who were known to have come from Aquitania and the land of Cantabari, barely a fourth escaped them, and late at night they returned to camp. On hearing the result of the battle, the bulk of the population of Aquitania, including the Tarbelli, Bagiriones, Petitiani, Vocates, Taurosates, Elusates, Gates, Asci, Garumni, Sibusates, and Cocosates, submitted to Crassus and voluntarily sent hostages. A few distant tribes trusted to the lateness of the season, as winter was coming on, and neglected to follow their example. About the same time Caesar led his army against the Morini and the Menapii, in the belief that the campaign could soon be finished. The summer was nearly over, but while all the rest of Gaul was tranquilized, they remained in arms, and had never sent envoys to him to sue for peace. Their tactics were quite different from those of the other Gauls. Being aware that the strongest tribes which had fought in the open field had been completely defeated, they took refuge, with all their belongings, in their continuous forests and marshes. On reaching the outskirts of the forest, Caesar proceeded to entrench his camp. No enemy had so far appeared, and the men were working in scattered groups, when suddenly the enemy rushed out from the forest from all sides and attacked them. The men quickly seized their weapons and drove them back into the forest with considerable loss, but pursuing them too far, over very difficult ground, lost a few of their own number. Caesar now proceeded to clear the forest, and continued doing so day after day. To prevent the soldiers from being attacked in flank, while they were unarmed and off their guard, he regularly laid the timber as it was felled in the direction of the enemy, and piled it as a barricade on both flanks. A large space was cleared with incredible speed in a few days, by which time the enemy's cattle and the rear portion of their baggage were in our hands, while they were making for the denser parts of the forest. But such stormy weather followed that the work had to be discontinued, and, owing to continuous rains, it was impossible to keep the soldiers longer under tents. Accordingly, after ravaging all the enemy's fields and burning their hamlets and homesteads, Caesar withdrew his troops and quartered them for the winter in the territories of the Aulerci, the Lexovi, and the other tribes which had recently been in arms. End of Book 3, Chapter 17 through 29. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar. Translated by Thomas Rice Holmes.
Book 4, Chapters 1 to 15 of Commentaries on the Gallic War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ted Garvin. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar. Translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book 4, Chapter 1. The fate of the Usipetes and Tencteri, Caesar's first invasion of Britain. In the following winter, the year in which Gnaeus Pompeius and Marcus Crassus were consuls, a German tribe, the Usipetes, accompanied by the Tencteri, crossed the Rhine in large numbers, not far from the point where it enters the sea. Their motive was that for several years they had been subject to harassing attacks from the Suebi, and prevented from tilling the land. The Suebi are by far the most numerous and warlike of all the German peoples. They are said to comprise 100 clans, each of which annually sends 1,000 armed men on a military expedition beyond the frontier. The rest of the population remain at home and support the expeditionary force as well as themselves. Next year they take up arms in their turn, and the others remain at home. Thus agriculture goes on uninterruptedly, along with theoretical and practical training in war. Private property in land, however, does not exist, and no one is allowed to remain for farming in one spot longer than a year. Not much corn, indeed, is consumed. The people live principally on milk and flesh meat, and spend much time in hunting. This, combined with the nature of their food, their constant exercise and freedom from restraint, for they have never from childhood been made to obey or subjected to discipline, and never do anything against their inclination, fosters their bodily vigor and produces a race of gigantic stature. Moreover, they have trained themselves to wear no clothing, even in the coldest districts, except skins, which leave a large part of the body bare, and to bathe in the rivers. 2. Traders are allowed to enter their country, not because they want to import anything, but that they may find purchasers for their booty. Even horses, of which the Gauls are extremely fond, and to procure which they go to great expense, are not imported by the Germans. The native horses are undersized and ugly, but by constant exercise they develop in themselves extraordinary powers of endurance. In cavalry combats they often dismount and fight on foot, training their horses to stand still, and quickly remounting when necessary. According to their notions, nothing is more shameful or unmanly than the use of saddles, and so, however small their numbers, they are ready to encounter any number of cavalry who use them. They will not allow wine to be imported at all, considering that its use enfeebles a man's power of endurance, and makes him effeminate. 3. The communities as such pride themselves on keeping the land round their own borders uninhabited as far as possible, regarding it as a proof that many tribes are unable to cope with them. Thus it is said that on one side of the Sueban territory there is an uninhabited tract extending about 600 miles. On the opposite side their neighbors are the Ubi, who were once a considerable tribe, and according to German standards, a flourishing tribe. They are in fact rather more civilized than the rest of the nation, for they are near the Rhine. Their country is much frequented by traders, and from propinquity they have become familiarized with Gallic customs. The Suebi, after many campaigns and frequent attempts, had found them too numerous and powerful to be dispossessed, but they made them tributary and reduced them to comparative insignificance and weakness. 4. The Usipetes and Tencteri, mentioned above, were in the same position. For several years they withstood the pressure of the Suebi, but at length they were dispossessed, and after wandering for many years through many parts of Germany, came to the Rhine. The Menapii inhabited that region, and owned lands, homesteads, and villages on both sides of the river, but alarmed by the incursion of this large host, they abandoned their dwellings on the further bank, established outposts on this side of the Rhine, and determined to prevent the Germans from crossing. The latter tried every expedient, but being unable to force a passage from want of boats, or to get across unobserved because of the Menapian patrols, pretended to return to the district where they had settled, marched on for 3 days, and then turned back again. Their cavalry made the whole journey in a single night, and swooped down upon the Menapii, who, knowing nothing of their movements, were off their guard, and having been informed by their patrols that they had gone off, had fearlessly recrossed the Rhine and returned to their villages. The Germans slaughtered them, seized their boats, crossed the river before the Menapii on this side of the Rhine could tell what they were about, took possession of all their buildings, and for the rest of the winter lived on their stores. 5. The unstable character of the Gauls caused Caesar anxiety, for they do not abide by their decisions, and are generally prone to revolution. Accordingly, when he learned the facts, he thought it best not to rely upon them at all. It is a custom of theirs to detain travellers, even against their will, and question them individually about what they have heard or ascertained on this or that topic. And in the towns the people cluster around traders, and make them say where they come from, and tell them the news. Influenced by these reports, even when they are merely hearsay, they often embark upon the most momentous enterprises, and as they trust blindly to vague gossip, and their informants generally tell lies and frame their answers to please them, they naturally repent of their plans as soon as they are formed. 6. Caesar was aware of this custom, and to avoid having a serious war on his hands, he started to rejoin his army earlier than usual. On his arrival he found that his forebodings were justified. Embassies had been sent by more than one tribe to the Germans, inviting them to quit the neighbourhood of the Rhine, and promising to supply all their requirements. Allured by this prospect, they were now wandering further afield, and had reached the territories of the Eburones and Condrusi, both dependents of the Treveri. Caesar summoned the Gallic notables, and thinking it well to dissemble what he knew, addressed them in soothing and reassuring terms, directed them to furnish cavalry, and announced his intention of taking the field against the Germans. 7. After arranging for a supply of grain, and selecting troopers from the several contingents, he began his march towards the districts in which he heard that the Germans were encamped. When he was within a few days' march from them, their envoys arrived, and addressed him as follows. The Germans were not the aggressors, but if they were provoked they would not shrink from a contest with the Roman people, for it was a principle of theirs, handed down by their forefathers, to resist all who attacked them, and not to sue for mercy. Still this much they would say, they had come reluctantly because they had been driven from their country. If the Romans cared for their goodwill, their friendship might be of use to them. Let the Romans either assign them lands, or suffer them to retain those which they had won by the sword. They acknowledged the superiority of the Suebi alone, for even the immortal gods were no match for them, and there was no other people upon earth whom they could not overcome. 8. Caesar made a suitable reply. The upshot of his speech was that there could be no friendship between him and the Germans if they remained in Gaul. It was not reasonable for people who could not defend their own territories to take possession of those of others, and besides, there were no unoccupied lands in Gaul which could be made over to any people, least of all to one so numerous, without injustice. Still, they might settle, if they wished, in the country of the Ubii, whose envoys were with him, complaining of the ill treatment of the Suebi, and asking for his aid, and he would order the Ubii to receive them. 9. The envoys said that they would prefer this offer to their principles, and after it had been considered, would return to Caesar in 3 days. Meanwhile they requested him not to move nearer. Caesar told them that it was impossible for him to make even this concession. He had ascertained that a large detachment of their cavalry had been sent across the Meuse some days before to the country of the Ambiviarti, to plunder and forage, and he believed that they were waiting for their return, and that was their motive for trying to gain time. 10. The Meuse rises in the Vosges Mountains, which are in the territory of the Lingones, receives an affluent called the Wall from the Rhine, thereby forming the island of the Batavi, and not more than 80 miles from that point flows into the ocean. The Rhine rises in the country of the Lepanti, who inhabit the Alps, and flows swiftly for a long distance through the territories of the Nantuetes, Helvetii, Sequani, Mediomatrici, Trebosi, and Treveri. As it approaches the sea, it branches off into several channels, and forms numerous large islands, many of which are inhabited by fierce rude tribes, some of whom are supposed to live on fish and birds' eggs, and discharges itself by numerous outlets into the ocean. 11. When Caesar was not more than 12 miles from the enemy, their envoys returned to him, according to agreement, and meeting him on his march, earnestly entreated him to advance no farther. As they could not induce him to comply, they begged him to send word to the cavalry, which had gone on in advance of the column, forbidding them to fight, and to let them send envoys to the Ubi, declaring that if their council and chiefs swore to keep faith with them, they would avail themselves of the terms which he offered, and asking him to give them 3 days to complete the arrangements. Caesar believed that all these stipulations had the same object, to secure 3 days' delay for the return of the absent cavalry. Still, he said that he would advance 4 miles and no more that day, to get water. On the morrow as many of them as could come were to assemble at his halting place, that he might take cognizance of their request. Meanwhile, he sent messengers to tell the cavalry officers, who had gone on in front of their whole force, not to attack the enemy, and in case they were attacked themselves, to remain on the defensive till he came up with the rest of the army. 12. Our cavalry, who numbered 5,000, felt no anxiety, as the German envoys had asked for an armistice for that day, and he had only just left Caesar. The moment the enemy caught sight of them, although they had not more than 800 horse, those who had crossed the Meuse to forage not having yet returned, they charged and speedily threw them into confusion, and when they rallied, the enemy, following their regular practice, sprang to the ground, stabbed their horses in the belly, and unhorsed a number of our men. They charged and speedily threw them into confusion, and when they rallied, the enemy, following their regular practice, sprang to the ground, stabbed their horses in the belly, and unhorsed a number of our men, sent the rest flying, and swept them along in such panic that they never drew rein till they came in sight of our column. 74 of our troopers were killed in the affair, including Piso, a gallant Aquitanian of the most illustrious family, whose grandfather had been honored by the Senate with the title of friend, and had held sovereignty in his own tribe. His brother was surrounded by the enemy, but he went to his assistance and rescued him, and though his horse was wounded and he was thrown, he resisted most gallantly as long as he could. Surrounded and covered with wounds, he fell, when his brother, who had by this time got away from the press and was some distance off, saw what had happened, and putting spurs to his horse, rode straight against the enemy and perished. 13. After this combat, Caesar no longer felt bound to listen to the envoys, or to entertain the proposals of a people who, after asking for peace, had made a treacherous, insidious, and unprovoked attack. On the other hand, he thought that it would be the height of folly to wait till the enemy were reinforced by the return of their cavalry. From his knowledge of the unstable character of the Gauls, he realized that the enemy, by a single victory, had already gained great prestige with them, and he thought it best to give them no time to form their plans. Having come to this decision, he communicated to his quaestor and generals his determination not to lose a day in forcing on a battle, when a most fortunate event occurred. Next day, early in the morning, a numerous deputation of the Germans, comprising all the leading men and all those of mature age, came to the camp, in the same spirit of treachery and deceit, to wait upon him. Their ostensible object was to clear themselves from complicity in the attack which had taken place the day before, contrary to the agreement which they had themselves asked for. At the same time they intended, if possible, to gain an extension of the armistice on some pretext. Caesar was delighted that they had put themselves in his power, and ordered them to be detained. He then marched out of camp at the head of his whole force, ordering the cavalry whom he believed to be demoralized by the recent combat, to bring up the rear. 14. Forming the army in 3 lines, he made a rapid march of 8 miles, and reached the enemy's camp before the Germans could realize what was going to happen. The rapidity of our advance and the absence of their leaders suddenly and completely unnerved them. There was no time to consider or to arm, and they were too distracted to know whether it was best to throw their strength against the enemy, to defend the camp, or to fly for their lives. Their terror was manifested by cries and hurried movements, and the soldiers, exasperated by the treachery of the previous day, burst into the camp. Those who were quick enough to seize their weapons made a brief stand there against our men, fighting under cover of their wagons and baggage. But the host of women and children, for they had left their country and crossed the Rhine with all their belongings, began to flee in all directions, and Caesar sent his cavalry to hunt them down. 15. The Germans heard the shrieks behind, and seeing that their kith and kin were being slaughtered, threw away their weapons, abandoned their standards, and rushed out of the camp. When they reached the confluence of the Moselle and the Rhine, great numbers were already killed, and the rest, giving up all hope of escape, plunged into the stream and there perished, overcome by terror, weariness, and the force of the current. Our men had anxiously anticipated an arduous struggle, for the enemy's numbers had amounted to 430,000, but all to a man returned safe to camp with only a very few wounded. Caesar gave the prisoners whom he had detained in camp the option of going free, but as they were afraid of being punished and tortured by the Gauls whose lands they had ravaged, they said that they would prefer to remain with him, and he permitted them to do so. End of chapter 15.
Book 4, Chapters 16 to 19 of Commentaries on the Gallic War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar. Translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book 4, Chapter 16. The campaign against the Germans being concluded, Caesar thought it advisable for many reasons to cross the Rhine. The most cogent reason was this. Observing that the Germans were so ready to invade Gaul, he desired to make them feel alarm on their own account, and realize that the army of the Roman people could and would cross the Rhine. There was another consideration. That division of the cavalry of the Usipetes and Tencteri which, as I have already related, had crossed the Meuse to plunder and forage, and had taken no part in the action, had recrossed the Rhine after the rout of their countrymen, taken refuge in the territory of the Sugambri, and joined forces with them. When Caesar sent envoys to the Sugambri, calling upon them to deliver up the fugitives, on the ground that they had made war upon him and upon Gaul, they replied that the Rhine was the limit of Roman dominion. If Caesar thought that the Germans had no right to cross over into Gaul without his permission, how could he claim any authority or power beyond the Rhine? The Ubii, on the other hand, who alone among the Transrhenane peoples had sent envoys to Caesar, entered into friendly relations with him, and, given hostages, earnestly entreated him to help them, as they were hard pressed by the Suebi, or if he were prevented from doing so by reasons of state, merely to throw his army across the Rhine, which would be sufficient to support them and assure their prospects for the future. The name and fame which his army had gained, even with the most distant German peoples, by defeating Ariovistus, and by this recent victory, were so great that they could safely rely on the prestige and friendship of the Roman people. At the same time, they promised to provide a large flotilla of boats for the passage of the army. Caesar was determined to cross the Rhine for the reasons which I have mentioned, but he thought it hardly safe to cross in boats, and considered that to do so would not be consistent with his own dignity or that of the Roman people. Therefore, although the construction of a bridge presented great difficulties on account of the breadth, swiftness, and depth of the stream, he nevertheless thought it best to make the attempt, or else not to cross at all. The principle upon which he designed the bridge was as follows. He took a couple of piles a foot and a half thick, had them sharpened to a point from a little above the lower end, and adapted in length to the varying depth of the river, and fastened them together at an interval of 2 feet. These piles he caused to be lowered into the river by means of floats, fixed and driven home with pile drivers, not vertically like ordinary piles, but leaning forward in the same plane, so that they followed the direction of the current. Then he had another couple of piles, similarly joined together, planted opposite them on the lower side at a distance of 40 feet, against the force and rush of the current. Beams 2 feet wide, fitting into the interval between the piles of each couple, were laid across, and the two couples were kept apart by a pair of braces on either side of the extremity. The couples being thus kept apart, and on the other hand held firmly in place, the strength of the structure was so great, and its principle so ordered, that the greater the force of the current, the more closely were the piles locked together. The series of piles and transverse beams was connected by timbers laid in the direction of the bridge, which were floored with poles and fascines. Finally, notwithstanding the existing strength of the structure, piles were also driven in diagonally on the downstream side, which were connected with the entire structure and planted below like a buttress, so as to break the force of the stream. Other piles were likewise planted a little above the bridge, so that in case the natives floated down trunks of trees or barges to demolish the structure, their force might be weakened by these bulwarks, and they might not injure the bridge. Within 10 days after the collection of the timber began, the whole work was finished, and the army crossed over. Caesar left a strong force at both ends of the bridge, and marched rapidly for the country of the Sugambri. Meanwhile, envoys came in from several tribes, and Caesar replied graciously to their prayer for peace and friendship, and directed them to bring him hostages. The Sugambri, on the contrary, from the moment when the construction of the bridge began, acting on the advice from the Tencteri and Usipetes, whom they were entertaining, had prepared for flight, left their country with all their belongings, and hidden themselves in the recesses of the forest. Caesar remained a few days in their country, burned all their villages and homesteads, cut down their corn, and returned to the territory of the Ubii. Promising to help them in case they were molested by the Subii, he ascertained from them that the latter, on learning from their scouts that the bridge was being made, had called a council according to their custom, and sent messengers in all directions bidding the people to abandon the strongholds, convey their wives and children and all their belongings into the forest, and assemble, all of them who could bear arms, at a fixed place nearly in the center of the region occupied by the Subii. Here they were awaiting the arrival of the Romans, and here they had determined to fight a decisive battle. Caesar had achieved every object for which he had determined to lead his army across, overawed the Germans, punished the Sugambri, and relieved the Ubii from hostile pressure. He felt that honor was satisfied, and that he had served every useful purpose. When, therefore, he heard the news about the Subii, he returned to Gaul, having spent just 18 days on the further side of the Rhine, and destroyed the bridge. End of chapter 19. Book 4, chapters 20 through 38 of Commentaries on the Gallic War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar, translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book 4, Chapter 20. Only a small part of the summer remained, and in these parts, the whole of Gaul having a northerly trend, winter sets in early. Nevertheless, Caesar made active preparations for an expedition to Britain, for he knew that in almost all the operations in Gaul our enemies had been reinforced from that country. Besides, if there were not time for a campaign, he thought that it would be well worth his while merely to visit the island, see what the people were like, and make himself acquainted with the features of the country, the harbors, and the landing places. For of all this the Gauls knew practically nothing. No one, indeed, readily undertakes the voyage to Britain except traders, and even they know nothing of it except the coast and the parts opposite the different regions of Gaul. Accordingly, though Caesar summoned traders from all parts to meet him, he could not ascertain the extent of the island, what tribes dwelt therein, their strength, their method of fighting, their manners and customs, or what harbors were capable of accommodating a large flotilla. To procure information on these points before risking the attempt, he sent Gaius Volusenus, whom he considered perfectly competent, with a galley, instructing him to make a thorough reconnaissance and return as soon as possible. At the same time he marched with his whole force for the country of the Morini, as the shortest passage to Britain was from their coast, and ordered ships to assemble there from all the ports in the adjacent districts, as well as the fleet which he had built in the previous summer for the war with the Veneti. Meanwhile his design became known and was reported by traders to the Britons, whereupon envoys came to him from several tribes of the island, promising to give hostages and to submit to the authority of the Roman people. On hearing what they had to say, Caesar graciously reassured them, and sent them home, enjoining them to abide by their resolve. Along with them he sent Commius, whom, after the overthrow of the Atrebates, he had set up as king over that people, a man of whose energy and judgment he had a high opinion, whom he believed to be loyal, and who was reputed to have great influence in the country. He instructed him to visit all the tribes he could, to urge them to trust in the good faith of the Roman people, and to announce that Caesar would soon arrive. Volusenus reconnoitred all the features of the coast as far as he could get the chance, for he could not venture to disembark and trust himself to the natives, and in 5 days returned to Caesar and reported his observations. While Caesar was waiting in these parts to get his ships ready for sea, envoys came from a large section of the Morini to apologize for their recent conduct in attacking the Roman people and promise obedience to his commands, pleading that they were uncivilized and knew nothing of our ways. Caesar regarded this as most opportune, for he had no wish to leave an enemy in his rear. Owing to the time of the year he had no means of undertaking a campaign, and he did not think it wise to postpone his expedition to Britain for trivialities. Accordingly he ordered the envoys to furnish a large number of hostages, and on their arrival admitted the Morini to terms. About 80 transports, which he considered sufficient to convey 2 legions, were collected and assembled. The galleys which he had besides he assigned to the quaestor, the generals, and the auxiliary officers. Besides these there were 18 transports 8 miles off, which were prevented from making the same harbor by contrary winds. These he assigned to the cavalry, placing the rest of the army under the command of 2 generals, Quintus Titurius Sabinus and Lucius Aurunculeius Cotta, with orders to march against the Menapii and those clans of the Morini from which no envoys had come. He directed another general, Publius Sulpicius Rufus, to hold a port with a force which he considered adequate. The arrangements were now complete, and, taking advantage of favorable weather, he set sail about the 3rd watch, directing the cavalry to march to the further harbor, embark there, and follow him. They were rather dilatory in getting through their work, but Caesar, with the leading ships, reached Britain about the 4th hour, and there, standing in full view on all the heights, he saw an armed force of the enemy. The formation of the ground was peculiar, the sea being so closely walled in by abrupt heights that it was possible to throw a missile from the ground above on to the shore. Caesar thought the place most unsuitable for landing, and accordingly remained till the 9th hour, waiting at anchor for the other ships to join him. Meanwhile he assembled the generals and tribunes, told them what he had learned from Volusenus, and explained his own plans, charging them to bear in mind the requirements of war and particularly of seamanship, involving as it did rapid and irregular movements, and to see that all orders were carried out smartly and at the right moment. The officers dispersed, and, getting wind and tide together in his favor, Caesar gave the signal, weighed anchor, and sailing on about 7 miles further, ran the ships aground on an open and evenly shelving shore. The natives knew what the Romans intended. Sending on ahead their cavalry and charioteers, a kind of warriors whom they habitually employ in action, they followed with the rest of their force and attempted to prevent our men from disembarking. It was very difficult to land for these reasons. The size of the ships made it impossible for them to ground except in deep water. The soldiers did not know the ground, and with their hands loaded and weighted by their heavy, cumbrous armor, they had to jump down from the ships, keep their foothold in the surf, and fight the enemy all at once. While the enemy had all their limbs free, they knew the ground perfectly, and standing on dry land or moving forward a little into the water, they threw their missiles boldly and drove their horses into the sea which they were trained to enter. Our men were unnerved by the situation, and having no experience of this kind of warfare, they did not show the same dash and energy that they generally did in battles on land. Caesar, noticing this, ordered the galleys, with the look of which the natives were not familiar, and which were easier to handle, to sheer off a little from the transports, row hard, and range alongside of the enemy's flanks, and slingers, archers, and artillery to shoot from their decks and drive the enemy out of the way. This maneuver was of great service to our men, for the natives, alarmed by the build of the ships, the motion of the oars, and the strangeness of the artillery, stood still and then drew back a little. And now, as our soldiers were hesitating, chiefly because of the depth of the water, the standard-bearer of the 10th, praying that his attempt might redound to the success of the legion, cried, "Leap down, men, unless you want to abandon the eagle to the enemy. I, at all events, shall have done my duty to my country and my general." Uttering these words in a loud voice, he threw himself overboard, and advanced bearing the eagle against the enemy. Then, calling upon each other not to suffer such a disgrace, the men leaped all together from the ship. Seeing this, their comrades in the nearest ships followed them and advanced close up to the enemy. Both sides fought with spirit, but the Romans, being unable to keep their ranks unbroken, or get firm foothold, or follow their respective standards, and as they came from this or that ship, joining any standard they met, became greatly confused, while the enemy knew all the shallows, and when from their standpoint on shore they saw a few men disembarking one by one, urged on their horses, and surrounding the little group in numbers, attacked them before they were ready. Others again got on the exposed flank of an entire company and plied them with missiles. Caesar, noticing this, ordered the men of war's boats and also the scouts to be manned, and whenever he saw any of his men in difficulties, sent them to the rescue. Our men, as soon as they got upon dry land, followed by all their comrades, charged the enemy and put them to flight, but could not pursue them far because the cavalry had not been able to keep their course and make the island. This was the only drawback to Caesar's usual good fortune. The beaten enemy, on rallying after their flight, at once sent envoys to Caesar to sue for peace, promising to give hostages and to obey his commands. The envoys were accompanied by the Atrebatian Commius, who, as I have already related, had been sent on by Caesar to Britain in advance. He had just landed, and, in the character of an envoy, was conveying Caesar's mandates to the Britons, when they seized him and locked him with chains. But now, after the battle, they sent him back, and, while suing for peace, laid the blame of the outrage upon the rabble, and begged that it might be overlooked in consideration of their ignorance. Caesar complained that after the Britons had spontaneously sent envoys to the continent and asked him for peace, they had attacked him without provocation, but said that he would pardon their ignorance and demanded hostages. Part of the required number they handed over at once, saying that they had to fetch the rest from long distances, and would deliver them in a few days. Meanwhile they ordered their followers to go back to their districts, while chiefs began to come in from all parts, and place themselves and their tribes under Caesar's protection. Peace had been thus established when, 3 days after the expedition reached Britain, the 18 ships mentioned above, which had taken the cavalry on board, sailed from the upper port with a light breeze. They were getting close to Britain, and were seen from the camp, when such a violent storm suddenly arose that none of them could keep their course, but some were carried back to the point from which they had started, while the others were swept down in great peril to the lower and more westerly part of the island. They anchored, notwithstanding, but as they were becoming waterlogged, were forced to stand out to sea in the face of night and make for the continent. The same night it happened to be full moon, which generally causes very high tides in the ocean, a fact of which our men were not aware. The result was that the galleys, in which Caesar had brought over troops, and which he had drawn up on dry land, were waterlogged, while the transports which were at anchor were damaged by the storm, and the men were unable to be of any service or go to their assistance. Several ships were wrecked, the rest were rendered useless by the loss of their rigging, anchors, and other fittings, and naturally the whole army was seized by panic. There were no other ships to take them back. Everything required for repairing ships was lacking, and as the troops all understood that they would have to winter in Gaul, no corn for the winter had been provided on the spot. When this became known, the British chiefs who had waited on Caesar after the battle took counsel together. They knew that the Romans had neither cavalry nor ships nor grain, and they gathered that their troops were few from the smallness of the camp, which, as Caesar had taken over the legions without heavy baggage, was extraordinarily contracted. They therefore concluded that their best course would be to renew hostilities, cut off our men from corn and other supplies, and protract the campaign till winter, being confident that, if they overpowered them or prevented their return, no invader would ever again come over to Britain. Accordingly, they renewed their oaths of mutual fidelity, and began to move away one by one from the camp, and to fetch their tribesmen secretly from the districts. Caesar was not yet aware of their plans, but from what had happened to his ships, and from the fact that the chiefs had left off sending hostages, he guessed what was coming. Accordingly, he prepared for all contingencies. He had corn brought in daily from the fields into camp, utilized the timber and bronze belonging to the ships that had been most severely damaged to repair the rest, and ordered everything required for the purpose to be brought over from the continent. The men worked with hearty good will, and thus, although 12 ships were lost, he managed to have the rest made tolerably seaworthy. Meanwhile, a legion known as the 7th was sent out in the ordinary course to fetch corn. So far no one had suspected that hostilities were brewing, for some of the natives still remained in the districts, while others were actually passing in and out of the camp. But the troops on guard in front of the gates of the camp reported to Caesar that an unusual amount of dust was to be seen in the direction in which the legion had gone. Suspecting, with good reason as it happened, that the natives had hatched some scheme, Caesar ordered the cohorts on guard to accompany him in the direction indicated, 2 of the others to relieve them, and the rest to arm and follow him immediately. He had advanced some little distance from the camp when he observed that his troops were hard pressed by the enemy and could barely hold their own, the legion being huddled together and missiles hurled in from all sides. All the corn had been cut except in this one spot, and the enemy, anticipating that the Romans would come here, had laid in wait in the woods during the night. Then, when the troops had laid aside their weapons and were dispersed and busy reaping, they had suddenly fallen upon them. A few were killed, the rest, whose ranks were not properly formed, were thrown into confusion, and the enemy's horse and war chariots had at the same time encompassed them. Chariots are used in action in the following way. First of all, the charioteers drive all over the field, the warriors hurling missiles, and generally they throw the enemy's ranks into confusion by the mere terror inspired by their horses and the clatter of the wheels. As soon as they have penetrated between the troops of cavalry, the warriors jump off the chariots and fight on foot. The drivers meanwhile gradually withdraw from the action and range the cars in such a position that, if the warriors are hard pressed by the enemy's numbers, they may easily get back to them. Thus they exhibit in action the mobility of cavalry combined with the steadiness of infantry, and they become so efficient from constant practice and training that they will drive their horses at full gallop, keeping them well in hand down a steep incline, check and turn them in an instant, run along the pole, stand on the yoke, and step backwards again to the cars with the greatest nimbleness. Our men were unnerved by these movements because the tactics were new to them, and Caesar came to their support in the nick of time. When he came up, the enemy stood still, and our men recovered from their alarm. Thinking, however, that the moment was not favorable for challenging the enemy and forcing on a battle, he simply maintained his position, and, after a short interval, withdrew the legions into camp. During these operations our people were all busy, and the rest of the Britons who were still in their districts left them. Stormy weather followed for several days running, which kept the troops in camp and prevented the enemy from attacking. Meantime the natives sent messengers in all directions, telling their tribesmen that our troops were few, and pointing out that they had an excellent opportunity for plundering and establishing their independence for good by driving the Romans from their camp. By these representations they speedily got together a large body of horse and foot and advanced against the camp. Caesar foresaw that what had happened on previous days would happen again. Even if the enemy were beaten, their mobility would enable them to get off scot-free. However, he luckily obtained about 30 horsemen, whom the Atrebatian Commius, already mentioned, had taken over with him, and drew up the legions in front of the camp. A battle followed, and the enemy, unable to stand long against the onset of our troops, turned and fled. The troops pursued them as far as their speed and endurance would permit, and killed a good many of them. Then, after burning all the buildings far and wide, they returned to camp. On the same day the enemy sent envoys who came to Caesar to sue for peace. He ordered them to find twice as many hostages as before, and take them across to the continent. For the equinox was near, and as his ships were unsound, he did not think it wise to risk a stormy passage. Taking advantage of favorable weather, he set sail a little after midnight. All the ships reached the continent in safety, but 2 transports were unable to make the same harbors as the rest, and drifted a little further down. About 300 infantry had landed from these 2 vessels, and were making the best of their way to camp, when the Morini, who had been quite submissive when Caesar left them on his departure for Britain, surrounded them in the hope of plunder, and told them if they did not want to be killed to lay down their arms. The Morini were not very numerous at first, but when the soldiers formed square and defended themselves, about 6,000, hearing the uproar, quickly assembled. On receiving the news, Caesar sent all his cavalry from camp to rescue his men. Meanwhile our soldiers sustained the enemy's onslaught and fought most gallantly for more than 4 hours. A few of them were wounded, but they killed many of their assailants. After our cavalry came in sight, the enemy threw away their arms and fled, and a large number of them were cut to pieces. Next day Caesar sent Titus Labienus, in command of the legions which he had brought back from Britain, to punish the rebellious Morini. The marshes, which had served them as a refuge in the previous year, were dried up, and having no place to escape to, almost all of them fell into the hands of Labienus. Quintus Titurius and Lucius Cotta, the generals who had led the other legions into the country of the Menapii, finding that they had all taken refuge in the thickest part of their forests, ravaged all their lands, cut their corn, burned their homesteads, and returned to Caesar, who quartered all the legions for the winter in the country of the Belgae. Thither 2 British tribes, and no more, sent hostages. The rest neglected to do so. In honor of these achievements, the Senate, on receiving Caesar's dispatches, appointed a thanksgiving service of 20 days. End of chapter 38.
Book 5, Chapters 1 to 14 of Commentaries on the Gallic War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar, translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book 5. Caesar's second invasion of Britain, the disaster at Aduatuca, Quintus Cicero at bay, the doom of Indutiomarus. Chapter 1. When Caesar, according to his yearly custom, was leaving his winter quarters for Italy, in the consulship of Lucius Domitius and Appius Claudius, he ordered the generals whom he had placed in command of the legions to have as many ships as possible built during the winter and the old ones repaired. He explained the principle and indicated the lines on which they were to be built. To enable them to be loaded rapidly and hauled up on shore, he had them made a little shallower than those which are habitually used in the Mediterranean, especially as he found that, owing to the frequent ebb and flow of the tides, the waves there are comparatively small. On the other hand, to carry stores as well as the numerous horses, he built them a little wider than those which we use in other waters. All these vessels he ordered to be constructed both for rowing and sailing, which was greatly facilitated by their low freeboard, and the tackle required for fitting them out to be imported from Spain. After finishing the assizes in Cisalpine Gaul, he started for Illyricum, hearing that the Pirusti were making devastating raids upon the adjacent part of the province. On his arrival, he levied troops from the tribes and ordered them to concentrate at a prescribed place. The Pirusti, on hearing of this, sent envoys to tell him that the authorities were not responsible for anything that had occurred, and declared themselves ready to make full reparation. After listening to what the envoys had to say, Caesar ordered them to furnish hostages, who were to be brought to him by a fixed date, warning them that, in default of compliance, he would attack the tribe. The hostages were brought punctually, in obedience to his orders, and he appointed umpires to weigh the matters in dispute between the several tribes and settle the fines. 2. After disposing of these affairs and finishing the assizes, Caesar returned to Cisalpine Gaul, and thence started to join the army. On his arrival, he inspected all the camps, and found that, thanks to the extraordinary energy of the troops, and notwithstanding the extreme deficiency of resources, about 600 ships of the class described above and 28 galleys had been built, and would be ready for launching in a few days. Heartily commending the soldiers and the officers who had superintended the work, he gave the necessary instructions, and ordered all the ships to assemble at the Itian harbour, from which he had ascertained that the passage to Britain was most convenient, the run from the continent being about 30 miles. Leaving an adequate number of troops to effect this movement, he started with 4 legions in light marching order and 800 horse for the country of the Treveri, as they would not attend his counsels or submit to his authority, and were said to be making overtures to the Transrhenane Germans. 3. This tribe possesses by far the most powerful cavalry in the whole of Gaul, as well as numerous infantry; and, as we have remarked above, its territory reaches the Rhine. 2 rivals, Indutiomarus and Cingetorix, were engaged in a struggle for supremacy. The latter, as soon as the approach of Caesar and his legions was known, presented himself before him, gave an assurance that he and all his followers would remain staunch and not break off their friendship with the Romans, and told him what was going on amongst the Treveri. Indutiomarus, on the other hand, proceeded to levy horse and foot and to make preparations for war, while he sent those who were not of an age to bear arms into the Ardennes, a forest of vast extent, which stretches from the Rhine through the heart of the Treveran territory to the frontier of the Remi. Some leading men, however, of the former tribe, influenced by friendship for Cingetorix and alarmed by the arrival of our army, came to Caesar and, feeling unable to do anything for their country, began to proffer petitions on their own behalf. Thereupon Indutiomarus, afraid of being left in the lurch, sent envoys to Caesar to say that he had only refrained from leaving his followers and presenting himself before him in order to keep the tribe loyal, lest, if all the men of rank left them, the masses, in their ignorance, might fall away. Accordingly the people were under his control, and, if Caesar would allow him, he would wait upon him in his camp and entrust his own interests and those of his community to his protection. 4. Caesar was aware of his motive for saying this and of the circumstances that deterred him from prosecuting his design. Still, in order to avoid having to waste the summer in the country of the Treveri after having made all his preparations for a campaign in Britain, he told Indutiomarus to present himself with 200 hostages. When they were brought, amongst them being a son of Indutiomarus and all his relations, whom Caesar had summoned expressly. He spoke to him kindly and urged him to remain staunch. Nevertheless he summoned the leading men of the Treveri, and called upon them individually to support Cingetorix. He felt that Cingetorix deserved this service at his hands, and at the same time he thought it most important that a man of whose remarkable goodwill towards himself he had clear evidence should, as far as possible, command the respect of his own countrymen. Indutiomarus bitterly resented this action as diminishing his own credit, and, whereas he had already been ill disposed towards us, this grievance kindled his indignation into a fiercer flame. 5. After settling these affairs, Caesar moved with the legions to the Ischian harbour. There he learned that 60 ships, which had been built in the country of the Meldi, had been driven back by stress of weather, and, failing to keep their course, had returned to the point from which they had started. The rest he found completely fitted out and ready for sea. Some 4,000 cavalry from the whole of Gaul and the leading men from all the tribes assembled at the same place. A few of them, whose fidelity he was assured, he had determined to leave in Gaul, taking the rest with him as hostages, as he was afraid that, during his absence, there would be disturbances in the country. 6. Amongst the other hostages was the Aeduan, Dumnorix, of whom we have already spoken. Caesar had determined to keep this man particularly under his eye, because he knew him to be an ardent revolutionary, fond of power, a man of masterful character, and possessing great influence with the Gauls. Moreover, Dumnorix had stated in the Aeduan council that Caesar was going to confer upon him the sovereignty over the tribe, and the Aedui were seriously offended at this remark, and yet did not venture to send envoys to Caesar to protest or to depreciate his intention. Caesar had learned this from natives who were his friends. Dumnorix at first earnestly prayed for leave to remain in Gaul, partly on the ground that he was not accustomed to being on board ship and dreaded the sea, partly, as he alleged, because he was debarred by religious obligations. Finding that his request was steadily refused and that there was no hope of getting Caesar's consent, he began to importune the Gallic magnates, taking them aside one by one and urging them to remain on the continent. He wrought upon their fears. He told them that there was some strong reason for robbing Gaul of all her men of rank. Caesar shrank from putting them to death under the eyes of their countrymen, but his purpose was to take them all over to Britain and there murder them. He made them promise to stay, and called upon them to swear that they would unite in carrying out the policy which they saw to be for the interest of Gaul. These intrigues were reported to Caesar by numerous informants. 7. Having learned the facts, he determined, inasmuch as it was his policy to treat the Aedui with special distinction, that it was his duty to coerce and intimidate Dumnorix by every means in his power, and, as his frenzy was evidently passing all bounds, to see that he did no injury to himself personally or to the public interest. For about 25 days he was kept waiting in the port, because the northwest wind, which commonly blows throughout a great part of the year on these coasts, made it impossible to sail. Accordingly he did his best to keep Dumnorix steady, but at the same time to acquaint himself with all his plans. At length, taking advantage of favourable weather, he ordered the infantry and cavalry to embark. While everybody's attention was distracted, Dumnorix, accompanied by the Aeduan cavalry, left the camp without Caesar's knowledge, and started for his own country. On receiving the news, Caesar broke off his departure, postponed all his arrangements, and sending a strong detachment of cavalry to pursue Dumnorix, ordered him to be brought back, and, in case he resisted and refused to submit, to be put to death, for he thought that a man who disregarded his authority when he was present would not behave rationally in his absence. When called upon to return he resisted, defended himself with vigour, and adjured his retainers to be true to him, crying loudly and repeatedly that he was a free man and belonged to a free people. The cavalry, in obedience to orders, surrounded the fellow and put him to death, but, the Aeduan cavalry all returned to Caesar. 8. Having disposed of this business, Caesar, leaving Labienus on the continent with 3 legions and 2,000 cavalry to protect the ports, provide for a supply of corn, ascertain what was passing in Gaul, and act as the circumstances of the moment might dictate, set sail towards the sunset with 5 legions and the same number of cavalry as he had left behind. A light southwesterly breeze wafted him on his way, but about midnight the wind dropped. He failed to keep his course, and, drifting far away with the tide, he descried Britain at daybreak lying behind on the port quarter. Then, following the turn of the tide, he rowed hard to gain the part of the island where, as he had learned in the preceding summer, it was best to land. [Footnote: Between Deal Castle and Sandwich, a little north of where he landed in 55 B.C.] End footnote. The energy shown by the soldiers on this occasion was most praiseworthy. Rowing hard without a break they kept up in their heavily laden transports with the ships of war. The ships all reached Britain about midday, but no enemy was visible. Large numbers, as Caesar found out afterwards from prisoners, had assembled on the spot, but, alarmed by the great number of ships, more than 800 of which, counting those of the preceding year and the private vessels which individuals had built for their own convenience, were visible at once, they had quitted the shore and withdrawn to the higher ground. 9. Caesar disembarked the army and chose a suitable spot for a camp. Footnote: Perhaps on the gently rising ground near Worth. End footnote. Having ascertained from prisoners where the enemy's forces were posted, he left 10 cohorts and 300 cavalry near the sea to protect the ships, and marched against the enemy about the 3rd watch. He felt little anxiety for the ships, as, he was leaving them at anchor on a nice open shore. The ships and the detachment which protected them were placed under the command of Quintus Atrius. After a night march of about 12 miles Caesar descried the enemy's force. Advancing with their cavalry and chariots from higher ground towards a river, they attempted to check our men and force on an action. Footnote: The river was the Great Star, and Caesar crossed it near Canterbury, probably at Thannington. End footnote. Beaten off by the cavalry, they fell back into the woods and occupied a well-fortified post of great natural strength, which they had apparently prepared for defense some time before with a view to intestine war, for all the entrances were blocked by felled trees laid close together. Footnote: Probably Bigbury Camp, about a mile and a half west of Canterbury, traces of which still exist. End footnote. Fighting in scattered groups, they threw missiles from the woods, and tried to prevent our men from penetrating within the defences; but the soldiers of the 7th Legion, locking their shields over their heads, and piling up lumber against the defences, captured the position and drove them out of the woods at the cost of a few wounded. Caesar, however, forbade them to pursue the fugitives far, partly because he had no knowledge of the ground, partly because much of the day was spent and he wished to leave time for entrenching his camp. 10. On the following morning he sent a light force of infantry and cavalry, in 3 columns, to pursue the fugitives. They had advanced a considerable distance, the rearguard being just in sight, when some troopers from Quintus Atrius came to Caesar with the news that there had been a great storm on the preceding night, and that almost all the ships had been damaged and gone ashore, as the anchors and the cables did not hold, and the seamen and their captains could not cope with the force of the storm. The collisions between different vessels had therefore caused heavy loss. 11. On receiving this information, Caesar recalled the legions and cavalry, ordering them to defend themselves as they marched, and went back himself to the ships. He saw with his own eyes much the same as he had learned from the messengers and the dispatch which they brought. About 40 ships were lost, but it seemed possible to repair the rest, though at cost of considerable trouble. Accordingly he selected skilled workmen from the legions and ordered others to be sent for from the continent, at the same time writing to tell Labienus to build as many ships as possible with the legions under his command. Although it involved great trouble and labor, he decided that the best plan would be to have all the ships hauled up and connected with the camp by one entrenchment. About 10 days were spent in these operations, the troops not suspending work even in the night. As soon as the ships were hauled up and the camp strongly fortified, Caesar left the same force as before to protect them, and advanced to the point from which he had returned. By the time that he arrived reinforcements of Britons had assembled on the spot from all sides. The The chief command and the general direction of the campaign had been entrusted by common consent to Castellanus, whose territories are separated from those of the maritime tribes by a river called the Thames, about 80 miles from the sea. He had therefore been incessantly at war with the other tribes; but in their alarm at our arrival the Britons had made him commander-in-chief. 12. The interior of Britain is inhabited by a people who, according to oral tradition, so the Britons themselves say are aboriginal; the maritime districts by immigrants who crossed over from Belgium to plunder, and attack the aborigines, almost all of them being called after the tribes from whom the first comers were an offshoot. When the war was over they remained in the country and settled down as tillers of the soil. The population is immense. Homesteads, closely resembling those of the Gauls, are met with at every turn, and cattle are very numerous. Gold coins are in use, or, instead of coins, iron bars of fixed weight. Tin is found in the country in the inland, and iron in the maritime districts, but the latter only in small quantities. Bronze is imported. Trees exist of all the varieties which occur in Gaul, except the beech and the fir. Hares, fowls, and geese they think it impious to taste, but they keep them for pastime or amusement. The climate is more equable than in Gaul, the cold being less severe. 13. The island is triangular in shape, one side being opposite Gaul. One corner of this side, by Kent, the landing place for almost all the ships from Gaul, has an easterly, and the lower one a southerly aspect. The extent of this side is about 500 miles. The second trends westward towards Spain. Off the coast there is Ireland, which is considered only half as large as Britain, though the passage is equal in length to that between Britain and Gaul. Halfway across is an island called Man, and several smaller islands also are believed to be situated opposite this coast, in which, according to some writers, there is continuous night, about the winter solstice, for 30 days. Our inquiries could elicit no information on the subject, but by accurate measurements with a water clock we could see that the nights were shorter than on the continent. The length of this side, according to the estimate of the natives, is 700 miles. The third side has a northerly aspect, and no land lies opposite it. Its corner, however, looks, if anything, in the direction of Germany. The length of this side is estimated at 800 miles. Thus the whole island is 2,000 miles in circumference. 14. By far the most civilized of all the natives are the inhabitants of Kent, a purely maritime district, whose culture does not differ much from that of the Gauls. The people of the interior do not, for the most part, cultivate grain, but live on milk and flesh meat and clothe themselves with skins. All the Britons, without exception, stain themselves with woad, which produces a bluish tint. This gives them a wild look in battle. They wear their hair long, and shave the whole of their body except the head and the upper lip. Groups of 10 or 12 men have wives in common, brothers generally sharing with each other and fathers with their sons. The offspring of these unions are counted as the children of the man to whose home the mother, as a virgin, was originally taken. End of chapter 14. Book 5, chapters 15 to 23 of Commentaries on the Gallic War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Commentaries on the Gallic War, by Julius Caesar. Translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book 5, Chapter 15. The enemy's horsemen and charioteers kept up a fierce running fight with their cavalry, the latter, however, getting the best of it at all points, and driving the enemy into the woods and onto the hills. They killed a good many, but, pursuing too eagerly, lost some of their own number. After a time, while our men were off their guard and occupied in entrenching their camp, the enemy suddenly dashed out of the woods, swooped down upon the outpost in front of the camp, and engaged it in a hot combat. And when Caesar sent 2 cohorts, the first of their respective legions, to the rescue, which were separated from each other by a very small interval, our men were unnerved by tactics which were new to them, and they boldly charged between the two and got back unhurt. Quintus Liberius Durus, a military tribune, was killed that day. After additional cohorts had been sent up, the enemy were beaten off. 16. Throughout this peculiar combat, which was fought in full view of every one and actually in front of the camp, it was clear that the infantry, owing to the weight of their armor, were ill fitted to engage an enemy of this kind, for they could not pursue him when he retreated, and they dared not abandon their regular formation; also that the cavalry fought at great risk, because the enemy generally fell back on purpose, and, after drawing our men a little distance away from the legions, leaped down from their chariots and fought on foot with the odds in their favour. On the other hand, the mode in which their cavalry fought exposed the Romans, alike in retreat and in pursuit, to an exactly similar danger. [Footnote: Caesar probably meant that the mode in which the British cavalry fought, in cooperation with the charioteers, exposed the Romans, alike in retreat and in pursuit, to exactly the same danger. End footnote. Besides, the Britons never fought in masses, but in groups separated by wide intervals. They posted reserves and relieved each other in succession, fresh vigorous men taking the places of those who were tired. 17. Next day the enemy occupied a position on the heights at a distance from the camp, and began to show themselves in scattered groups and harass our cavalry, but with less vigor than the day before. At midday, however, Caesar having sent 3 legions and all his cavalry on a foraging expedition under one of his generals, Gaius Trebonius, they suddenly swooped down from all points on the foragers, not hesitating to attack the ordered ranks of the legions. The men charged them vigorously, beat them off, and continued to pursue them until the cavalry, relying upon the support of the legions, which they saw behind them, drove them headlong. They killed a great many of them and never allowed them to rally or make a stand or get down from their chariots. After this rout the reinforcements, which had assembled from all sides, immediately dispersed, and from that time the enemy never encountered us in a general action. 18. Having ascertained the enemy's plans, Caesar led his army to the Thames, into the territories of Cassivellaunus. The river can only be forded at one spot, and there with difficulty. On reaching this place, he observed that the enemy were drawn up in great force near the opposite bank of the river. The bank was fenced by sharp stakes planted along its edge, and similar stakes were fixed under water and concealed by the river. Having learned these facts from prisoners and deserters, Caesar sent his cavalry on in front, and ordered the legions to follow them speedily. But the men advanced with such swiftness and dash, though they only had their heads above water, that the enemy, unable to withstand the combined onset of infantry and cavalry, quitted the bank and fled. 19. Cassivellaunus, abandoning, as we have remarked above, all thoughts of regular combat, disbanded the greater part of his force, retaining only about 4,000 charioteers, watched our line of march, and, moving a little way from the track, concealed himself in impenetrable wooded spots, and removed the cattle and inhabitants from the open country into the woods in those districts through which he had learned that we intended to march. Whenever our cavalry made a bold dash into the country to plunder and devastate, he sent his charioteers out of the woods, for he was familiar with every track and path, engaged the cavalry to their great peril, and by the fear which he thus inspired prevented them from moving far afield. Caesar now had no choice but to forbid them to move out of touch with the column of infantry, and, by ravaging the country and burning villages, to injure the enemy as far as the legionaries' powers of endurance would allow. 20. Meanwhile the Trinovantes, about the strongest tribe in that part of the country, sent envoys to Caesar, promising to surrender and obey his commands. Mandubracius, a young chief of this tribe, whose father had been their king and had been put to death by Cassivellaunus, but who saved his own life by flight, had gone to the continent to join Caesar, and thrown himself upon his protection. The Trinovantes begged Caesar to protect Mandubracius from harm at the hands of Cassivellaunus, and to send him to rule over his own people with full powers. Caesar sent Mandubrasius, but ordered them to furnish 40 hostages and grain for his army. They promptly obeyed his commands, sending hostages to the number required and also the grain. 21. As the Trinovantes had been granted protection and immunity from all injury on the part of the soldiers, the Senemagni, Segontiaci, and Calites, Bibrosi, and Cassi sent embassies to Caesar and surrendered. Footnote: the Senemagni were perhaps identical with the Esseni or Iceni, who inhabited Suffolk and Norfolk. The Segontiaci may have been conterminous with, and were probably north of, the Atrebates, who occupied parts of Hampshire and Berkshire. The Bibrosi may have dwelt in Berkshire. All that is known about the geographical position of the Ancalites and Cassi is that they lived somewhere in the basin of the Thames, west or possibly north of the Trinovantian territory in Essex. End footnote. He learned from the envoys that the stronghold of Cassivellaunus, which was protected by woods and marshes, was not far off, and that a considerable number of men and of cattle had assembled in it. The Britons apply the name of stronghold to any woodland spot, difficult of access and fortified with a rampart and trench, to which they are in the habit of resorting in order to escape a hostile raid. Caesar marched to the spot indicated with his legions, and found that the place was of great natural strength and well fortified. Nevertheless he proceeded to assault it on 2 sides. The enemy stood their ground a short time, but could not sustain the onset of our infantry, and fled precipitately from another part of the stronghold. A great quantity of cattle was found in the place, and many of the garrison were captured as they were trying to escape, and killed. 22. While the operations above mentioned were going on in this district, Cassivellaunus sent envoys to Kent, which, as we have remarked above, is close to the sea, ordering Cingetonx, Carvilius, Taximugulus, and Segovax, the 4 kings who ruled over the country, to collect all their forces, and make a sudden descent upon the naval camp, and attack it. When they reached the camp, the officers made a sortie, killed many of them, captured their leader Legotorix, a man of rank, and withdrew their men without loss. On receiving news of the action, Cassivellaunus, who was greatly alarmed by the defection of the tribes, following the numerous disasters which he had sustained and the ravaging of his country, availed himself of the mediation of the Atrebatian, Commius, and sent envoys to Caesar to propose surrender. Caesar had resolved to winter on the continent, because disturbances were likely to break out suddenly in Gaul. Not much of the summer remained, and the enemy, as he knew, could easily spin out the time. Accordingly he ordered hostages to be given, and fixed the tribute which Britain was to pay annually to the Roman people, at the same time strictly forbidding Cassivellaunus to molest Mandubrasius or the Trinovantes. 23. On receiving the hostages, he led back the army to the sea, where he found the ships repaired. When they were launched, he arranged to take the army back in 2 trips, as he had a large number of prisoners and some ships had been destroyed by the storm. It so happened that of all this numerous fleet, after so many voyages, not a single vessel conveying troops was lost either in this or in the preceding year; while of the ships that were empty, comprising those which had landed troops after the first trip and were sent back to Caesar from the continent, and 60 others which Labienus had constructed after the wreck, only a very few reached their destination, nearly all the rest being driven back. Caesar waited for them a considerable time in vain, and then, for fear the lateness of the season, just before the equinox, should prevent his sailing, he was obliged to pack the troops rather closely. A dead calm followed, and unmooring at the beginning of the second watch, he reached land at dawn and brought all the ships safe ashore. Chapter 24.